I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we continue with section 11.8 in the Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers by George Young. We're picking up at the beginning of chapter 8. The Religious Cosmists. Four of the leading figures in what has often been called the Russian religious renaissance of the late 19th and early 20th centuries shared enough of the concerns central to Fedorov's thought that in Russia today their works are usually included in discussions of Russian Cosmism. As we shall see, each differed from the other three in important ways, and each created a body of work prominent on its own without regard to Cosmism or other schools of thought. Nevertheless, a common thematic thread does link them, and it is this common thread that we shall emphasize in our discussion. Vladimir Sergeyevich Solovyov, 1853 to 1900. And again, I apologize for any mistaken pronunciations of the Russian names. Vladimir Solovyov must be recognized as one of the greatest thinkers and spiritual leaders of the 19th century. A philosopher, a perfectly original mystic, a man of the prophetic type, a political thinker, a poet, and literary critic. The first thing that strikes one in all of Solovyov's writings and opens out horizons to the reader, transferring him into a different atmosphere, is the keenness and clarity with which Solovyov sees the invisible, the spiritual world. Solovyov shows the spiritual path which alone can lead humanity out of its present impasse. Quote by S.L. Frank. As a thinker whom probably all but the strictest Marxist-Leninist historians regard as the foremost Russian philosopher, Vladimir Solovyov cannot be described solely, or even primarily, as a religious cosmist. Indeed, most biographies and analytical studies make little or no reference to its association with Fedorov, treating their relationship at most as a footnote to the development of Solovyov's thought in the early 1890s. The emphasis is almost always on Solovyov's synthesizing of previous tendencies in Russian thought, his reaction against positivism, his debt to Schelling and Hegel, his attempts to reconcile Eastern and Western Christianity, his immersion in Kabbalah and the mysteries of divine Sophia, his ideas of God-manhood, all unity and incarnate love, his influence on the symbolist poets and on religious thinkers of the 20th century. But in addition to all the other sides of his work, Solovyov did also have a cosmist side. And we shall see his association with Fedorov played a more important role than is often realized in the development and expression of ideas, for which Solovyov and not Fedorov is best known. For this study, then, we shall say little about Solovyov's sophiology or about other aspects of his work, and focus primarily on his cosmist side and his relationship to Fedorov. Solovyov was born January 28, 1853, and died at the young age of 47 on August 13, 1900. His father was an eminent historian, author of a classic 29-volume history of Russia, and his mother was a deeply religious woman of mystical inclination, a descendant of the 18th century Ukrainian pilgrim, a bard, prophet, and philosopher, Grigory Skovoroda. Unlike Fedorov, Solovyov was born a conspicuously legitimate member of Russia's intellectual elite, a model for academic promise, a prodigy who from an early age was expected to become a major figure in Russian intellectual history. His life developed in part into a series of exits and detours from the straight and narrow academic road for which he had seemed destined. Again and again in life, he would first adhere to and then turn away from whatever intellectual current he was expected to follow. Raised in a traditional Orthodox Christian family with a profoundly devout mother and conventionally pious father, he converted to atheistic materialism at about age 13 and adopted the positivist nihilist views of the student generation of the 1860s, so memorably depicted in the character of Bazarov in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. He began his university studies in 1869 in the natural sciences, with a special interest in biology. After a couple of promising years in this direction, however, he dropped out of his science courses, auditing courses in history and philology, and after a year of mostly independent study, received the highest marks in his class on the state ruminations for his degree in 1873. But instead of continuing to the next logical rung of the academic ladder, advanced study of history or philosophy in France or Germany, he took what must have seemed a step backward for a budding nihilist, attending lectures at the Theological Academy of the famous Monastery of the Holy Trinity, founded by Saint Sergius. But at the monastery too, as previously at the university, he did not follow the expected course of studies. As an archbishop at the monastery later wrote, Soloviev came to the lecture wearing a great coat, felt boots, a beaver hat and muffler wound about his neck. He spoke to nobody. He merely walked to the window, stood there for a while, drummed with his fingers on the glass, turned round, and went away. At this time, Solovyov was in the process of rediscovering Orthodox Christianity, but his intellectual focus while at the monastery was on Western philosophy and spirituality, especially on the works of Plato, Schelling, and Bohm. While living among monks and seminarians, he was writing, revising, and publishing sections of his earliest philosophical works, his candidate's essay, The Mythological Process in Ancient Paganism, and his master's thesis, The Crisis in Western Philosophy Against the Positivists. In 1874, after a brilliant defense of his thesis, leading the eminent historian Bustayev-Rumin to declare, Russia is to be congratulated on a man of genius. Solovyov began to lecture on philosophy at the University of Moscow and also at the newly founded Women's University College. This work occupied him for less than a year. At the suggestion, apparently, of Dostoevsky, with whom he had recently become acquainted, Solovyov applied for a year's leave to study the Gnostic, Indian, and medieval philosophies in London. Thus, in June of 1875, Solovyov took lodgings in a rooming house on Great Russell Street and spent his days poring over Splendor Solis, Kabbalah Denudata, and other similar Rosicrucian alchemical and hermetic texts in the grand reading room of the nearby British Museum. In 3 meetings, a poem written in 1898, more than 20 years after his months in London, Solovyov vividly describes a mystical experience that he considered a major event in his life. He was fascinated by the idea of the Ein Sof, the infinite one of Kabbalistic literature. According to a Russian friend of his in London, L.I. Yansul, Solovyov would sit for hours in the reading room staring at one page. As Solovyov himself explains in his poem, he was meditating on the name and presence of Divine Sophia. In the reading room, I was alone most often, and whether you believe it or not, God sees powers hidden from me, were making choices, sending everything about her I could read. When sometimes I succumbed to a temptation to read from another opera, as they say, the stories would produce only confusion, and I would trudge home, feeling guilty all the way. But then it happened once. It was in autumn. I said to her, I sense you, know you're here. Oh, why, divinity's full flower, since childhood have you been so reluctant to appear? This thought inside my head had just been uttered when suddenly the golden azure shone, filling all space around, and she was present, her face glowing. Only her face alone. And that moment of bliss was long extended. And once more to this world my soul turned blind, and if my speech had been heard by someone serious, it would have seemed babble from a feeble mind. I said to her, your face appears before me, but I now wish to behold all of you. Why to a child would you reveal entirely what to a young man you withhold from view? Then be in Egypt, rang a voice inside me, first Paris, then off by steam toward the south. My feelings could not quarrel with reason, for reason, like an idiot, sat closed mouth. This was an offer Solovyov could not refuse. In one line of the poem, Sophia commands him to go to Egypt, and in the next line he is on his way. In actual fact, he may have taken a bit longer to get on his way, but by late October, Solovyov was in Cairo, staying at the Hotel Abat and enjoying philosophical and other conversations with another Russian in Egypt, General Rostislav Fedorov, who happened to be the uncle of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. At this point in his life, Solovyov may have known nothing about Madame Blavatsky and her occult researches. Years later, Solovyov would write disparagingly encyclopedia entries about her and her Theosophical Society, and his older brother, Vesvolod Solovyov, would notoriously denounce her as a fraudulent occultist and secret police spy. But while in London, Vladimir Solovyov had himself delved deeply into the same esoteric literature that would be Blavatsky's sources, and had frequented seances and other gatherings of occultists, just as Madame Blavatsky had done and was doing in New York. In addition to answering the summons from Sofia, one of the reasons for Solovyov's trip to Egypt in 1875 was to seek contact with an esoteric brotherhood, possibly the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, into which Blavatsky, then unknown to Solovyov, would claim to have been initiated. In London and in Egypt, then, Solovyov was attempting to immerse himself in the same esoteric lore and experience that, unknown to him, Madame Blavatsky, niece of his dinner companion General Fedorov, was probably writing about at that very moment and would soon publish as Isis Unveiled. In 3 meetings, he tells us that after he had been in Cairo a short time, Sophia, by means of an inner voice, summoned him into the desert for a 3rd definitive meeting. So at night, dressed in a European frock coat and top hat, he walked out into the desert and waited. He tells us that he nearly froze in the cold, a jackal threatened to eat him, and a gang of Bedouins suddenly captured him. But after a closer examination, the desert folk released him, thinking he was a devil. Then finally Sophia appeared to him, granting him the illumination that would last a lifetime. Paul Marshall Allen calls this Solovyov's Damascus experience. And indeed, even though Solovyov treats it half humorously, it was a profound event that would provide the sociological basis for all his subsequent work. For the remainder of his relatively brief life, Solovyov's writings, whether in verse or prose, heavy or light, would present a unique fusion of rationality and mysticism. Berdyaev writes of a day Solovyov and a night Solovyov, the former a formidably erudite master of order and clarity, and the latter a seer of profound intuition and dark, complex spirituality. Critical analyst by day, visionary poet by night. His gift was for crystalline, systematic elucidation of the most elusive ideas and perceptions, a rare ability to rationalize the irrational and articulate the ineffable. Both the letters he wrote in 1875 and the poem he wrote 20 years later show as well a remarkable ability to depict a life-changing experience in a tone that is both sincere and self-deprecatingly humorously and ironic. He would apparently detach himself at will from his most serious pursuits, could act and simultaneously view himself without forfeiting sincerity or credibility. On his return to Russia in 1876, Solovyov resumed his teaching duties at the university, but again only for a short time. In the spring of 1877, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he became a member of the scholarly committee in the Ministry of Education, and later that year began the series of 12 important public addresses known as the Lectures on God-Manhood. In March of 1881, following the assassination of Alexander II, Solovyov concluded one of his public lectures on the Enlightenment with a condemnation of the assassination and at the same time an appeal to the new Tsar Alexander III to set before Europe a bold example of compassionate Christian leadership by forgiving his father's assassins and renouncing capital punishment. This courageous and principled but rash appeal provoked such an uproar that Solovyov was forced to retire from teaching at the university and was henceforth forbidden to give public lectures or make public statements, officially curtailing his academic career. For the remaining 18 years of his life, he had no settled home or occupation, but subsisted primarily on the charity of friends, supplemented by meager earnings from his scholarly and journalistic writings. As noted earlier, Solovyov first learned of Fedorov's ideas, without knowing whose ideas they were, from Dostoevsky in 1878. between the 8th and 9th God-Manhood lectures. As Dostoevsky wrote in his letter to Fedorov's disciple Peterson, he waited for Solovyov after the 8th of the 12th lectures to read him Peterson's account of Fedorov's ideas. For Dostoevsky had found in their ideas much that is similar. Dostoevsky and Solovyov spent a beautiful 2 hours at this. Solovyov finds Fedorov's ideas much to his liking and had wished to say almost the same thing in his next lecture. And indeed, in the 9th God-Manhood lectures, Solovyov takes up some of the same themes that Fedorov had written about in the manuscript sent to Dostoevsky: the isolation of the modern individual, the natural world of everyday reality as a state that ought not to be, humanity as the potential, active, reifying agent of divine will, and all unity as the goal of Christian divine human action. Although the two thinkers had independently arrived at similar positions on several points, positions which were not unique to them, but shared with other 19th century Russian thinkers, a major difference between the two is evident even here before they meet. For Fedorov, the activity that will lead to all unity is the common task of resurrecting all the dead. For Solovyov, it is active God-manhood, Christ the Logos and Sophia the world soul, working together in us in unspecified divine human activity. At this point, Solovyov does not yet emphasize the idea of universal resurrection as a task, an active project for humanity. The personal relationship between the two thinkers and the development of the cosmist side of Solovyov's work began with their meeting at Tolstoy's Moscow residence in the autumn of 1881. In a fragment first published in 2000 as part of the 4th volume of his collective works, Fedorov writes, "At the end of September 1881, I became acquainted with Tolstoy and listened to the reading of his Gospel. There I also met Solovyov. In the autumn of that year, a Moscow correspondence was carried on, in which Tolstoy took part. In that same year began Tolstoy's conversion from a great writer to a bad philosopher. At that time also, the preface was brought to the attention of Solovyov, Tolstoy, and Trakov. They, Tolstoy and Solovyov, defended it against Trakov, who didn't like it. In the beginnings of the following year, Solovyov read the Project of Resurrection itself, about which he expressed his opinion in a letter of January 12, 1882. I remember well that at the end of January, on the 20th, Solovyov left for St. Petersburg to deliver a series of lectures in a state of enthusiasm. On the eve of departure, he read the first lecture which he intended to deliver. And on the very day of his departure, he visited me at my apartment in the same enthusiastic state, but later he came back very dejected. He told me that at the conclusion of the lecture, he talked with the students and observed that resurrection not as an idea but as a fact wasn't being grasped by them. And the next year, he became a Catholic. The letter that Solovyov wrote to Fedorov in January 1882 clearly confirms the younger thinker's initial enthusiasm. I read your manuscript avidly and with a delight of spirit, devoting all night and part of a morning to the reading for the next 2 days, Saturday and Sunday. Thought much about what I had read. I accept your project completely and without any discussion. What must be talked about is not the project itself, but several of the underlying theoretical assumptions or suppositions, and also the first practical steps towards its realization. On Wednesday, I'll bring the manuscript to you at the museum, and at the end of the week, we will somehow have to get together in the evening. I have a great deal to tell you. But in the meantime, I will say only that since the time of the appearance of Christianity, your project is the first forward movement of the human spirit along the way of Christ. For my part, I can only recognize you as my teacher and spiritual father. Your goal is not to proselytize, however, or found a sect, but to save all mankind by a common task. And for the sake of that, it is necessary, first of all, that your project be made known and be recognized by all. The means by which this might be accomplished, that is the main thing I would like to talk about with you when we meet. Be well, dear teacher and comforter. Over the next several years, Fedorov and Solovyov met often, and through what Prince Trubetskoy and others have called Solovyov's theocratic utopian period, Solovyov was essentially attempting to rework Fedorov's project into a coherent philosophical metaphysical system. As an example, in 1882 lecture, possibly the one Fedorov refers to in the fragment quoted above, later published as Vladimir Sergeyevich Solovyov's last lecture at St. Petersburg University. It is replete with Fedorovian cosmist declarations. The resolution of the worldwide conflict between private and public lies not in the destruction of what naturally exists, but in its resurrection and eternal life. And this resolution will be achieved through the rational and free activity of the human will. Mankind is obligated not to contemplate divinity, but to make itself divine. The new religion cannot be merely passive divine veneration or divine worship, but must become active divine works. Activum bogodieством. That is, the joint activity of divinity and humanity for the transformation of the latter from carnal or natural into spiritual and divine. In its entire structure, the reunited and healed world will be a true and complete image and likeness of the triune God. But as Fedorov noted in his criticism of this lecture, and in his later critiques on all Solovyov's writings on resurrection, the idea is presented only in the most general terms, with none of the scientific or other specific details that Fedorov considered the most important parts of the project. The closest they came to a real collaborative statement that would attempt to make Fedorov's project known and recognized by all was in 1891 when Solovyov was preparing an address to be delivered at an October 19th meeting of the Moscow Psychological Society, which the cream of Russia's intellectual society was expected to attend. Fedorov's disciple Peterson writes, Solovyov attempted to persuade Nikolai Fedderovich to present the call to the common task jointly with him, and for this reason proposed to write down what Fedorov would dictate to him. When he refused, Solovyov said to him, "What's the matter? Do you think Peterson can present your thoughts better than I can?" Finally, Fedorov agreed to Solovyov's proposition. A time was set, but Solovyov did not come. The paper that Solovyov read to the Psychological Society was The Collapse of the Medieval World Conception, which in religious and conservative circles, as the philosopher S. L. Frank tells us, produced the impression of a bombshell. The paper is basically Solovyov's variation of ideas outlined by Fedorov in his essay What History Is. But if the paper seemed too radical for the religious conservatives of the day, it did not seem radical enough to Fedorov, in a special critique of Solovyov's paper. A critique almost as long as the paper itself. Fedorov presents a point-by-point account of what Solovyov failed to say. That Solovyov had defined Christianity as the task of resurrection, and that he had argued that the medieval world conception had collapsed precisely because medieval Christianity had not understood and adopted that task, did not satisfy Fedorov. He laments that Solovyov said nothing about how that task was to be fulfilled. He blames what he calls Solovyov's vagueness about the means of resurrection on Solovyov's inability to understand the true implications of the task. But here Fedorov is clearly wrong. Solovyov did have a clear understanding of both the idea of resurrection and the means by which the resurrection would be achieved. But his understanding was altogether different from Fedorov's. Even in his first enthusiastic letter to Fedorov, Solovyov had mentioned that several of the underlying theoretical assumptions or suppositions had yet to be discussed. In his second letter to Fedorov, in June or July of 1882, Solovyov touches directly on one of the major points on which he ultimately had to disagree with his teacher and spiritual father. The task of resurrection, not only as a process, but even in the goal itself, is something conditional. The simple physical resurrection of the dead cannot in its own self be the goal. The resurrection of people in the same state in which they strive to devour each other, to resurrect man in a stage of cannibalism, would be both impossible and utterly undesirable. This means that the goal is not the simple resurrection of man in his personal organic structure, but the resurrection of man in the form he ought to take, namely, in that state in which all his parts and separate units do not exclude and change each other. You, of course, perfectly agree with this. We are all still children, and for this reason we need the child guidance of external religion. Consequently, in salutary religion and in the Church, we have not only elements in a prototype of the resurrection in the future kingdom of God, but also a present practical path and actual means toward the end. Therefore, our task must have a religious and not scientific character, and it must rely on the believing masses, not on disputatious intellectuals. So there is a short explanation for you of the feelings that I was trying to express to you my last time in Moscow. Until we meet again, dear teacher, God keep you. Take more care for your physical health. You have and rest you have in surplus. Are you collecting your manuscripts? It would be good to have them ready for the printer by autumn. We note that even after pointing out the major difference, spiritual against scientific, that will eventually separate them, Solovyov here still speaks of our task. He believed that what they shared was more important than any minor points of disagreement. And even after the Führer, following the 1891 address to the Psychological Society, Solovyov continued to emphasize the centrality of the idea of resurrection. In an 1894 letter to Tolstoy, he wrote, "Our, i.e. Solovyov and Tolstoy's entire disagreement comes down to one concrete point, Christ's resurrection." But Solovyov's idea of resurrection by then had little in common with Fedorov's. From the beginning, Solovyov viewed the resurrection as a spiritual task. He agreed with Fedorov that the resurrection would be real and personal, and was to be accomplished by human effort over a long period of time, perhaps as long as 10,000 years. But he completely rejects the technological side of Fedorov's project, and believes that spiritual development through exercises and disciplines already available in the world's religions will lead to resurrection. In the letter to Tolstoy mentioned above, he continues, "For man, immortality is the same as reason is for animals. The telos of the animal kingdom is the reasoning animal, i.e. man. The telos of humanity is the mortal one, i.e. Christ. As the animal world tends toward reason, so the human world tends toward immortality. If the struggle with chaos and death is the essence of the whole process, whereby the side of light and spirit ever so slowly and gradually takes control, then resurrection, i.e. actual and decisive victory of a living being over death, is a necessary element and indeed the culmination of that process." Solovyov compares the appearance of Christ, the firstborn from the dead, to the first appearance of a living organism in the organic world, or the first human among orangutans. Victory over death is a natural consequence of internal spiritual perfection, and a person in whom the spiritual principle has taken over all the lower functions cannot be overcome by death. Spiritual power, having attained its full degree of perfection, inevitably spills, as it were, over the edge of subjective mental life, fastens onto physical life, transforms it, and finally spiritualizes it completely, unites it constantly with itself. And it is precisely this image of complete spiritual perfection that Solovyov finds in the Christ of the Gospels. For Fedorov, we recall, the long resurrection project is one in which children will resurrect their parents, who in turn will resurrect their parents, and so back to Adam and Eve. The family is the basic unit of life, and in the project each family will grow backward through time, merging with other families until all humankind is literally one family. Brotherhood becomes co-sonship, sisterhood co-daughterhood. Universal brotherhood will be as obvious a given as existence. Solovyov is much less specific about how the project will be conducted. Generally, instead of children resurrecting parents, he writes of a growing brotherhood based not on race, nationality, or family ties, but on spiritual development. He seems to envision something like an Albigensian society of perfects, or a higher order of evolved Christians mingling with the lay population, like Madame Blavatsky's Masters of Theosophy, developing in the individual and in the population at large spiritual powers sufficient to overcome death. Fedorov, in more than one article, attacks Solovyov for valuing individual immortality over resurrection of the ancestors. To live forever without resurrecting one's parents is, for Fedorov, eternal adolescence, everlasting orphanhood. But contrary to Fedorov's contention, Solovyov does not confuse immortality with resurrection. He merely states that the task of creating immortal spirits must precede any attempts to resurrect the dead. Otherwise, one would be bringing people back to life only to let them die again. As Solovyov stated in the letter to Fedorov cited above, the simple physical resurrection of the dead cannot in its own self be the goal. For Fedorov, resurrection of the ancestors will coincide with the creation of heaven on earth, and this indeed should be the goal of all human action. For Solovyov, resurrection is part of the greater task of all unity, a human and natural world wholly integrated and wholly infused with divine spirit. Resurrection is, for Solovyov, the ultimate demonstration of divine human spiritual power, the ultimate victory of order over chaos and of love over discord. In his last work, A Short Story of the Antichrist, Solovyov parodies perhaps not Fedorov himself, but a representative of the Fedorovian idea in Apollonius, a man of genius semi-Asiatic and semi-European who marvelously combined a mastery of the most recent discoveries and technologies of Western science with a knowledge both practical and theoretical of all major tendencies in the traditional mysticism of the East. The results of this combination were amazing. Apollonius, for instance, had perfected the half-scientific and half-magical art of producing atmospheric electricity at will, so that it was said that he commanded fire down from heaven. Interesting. This is actually not far from one of Fedorov's fantastic projects mentioned above, whereby enormous cones of some kind would be placed on Earth in such a way that they would conduct electromagnetic force and allow men to steer Earth like a spaceship through the cosmos in search of particles of departed ancestors. Instead of regulating nature, whether external or internal, Solovyov views the great human task as one of the incarnating divine love on a universal scale. In one of his major works, The Meaning of Love, he develops the idea of a Christian androgyny that would embrace all humanity. In the present world, physical love exists in an embryo, as a promise, a foretaste of a greater love that will embrace the entire world of the future. It is love, now embryonic but eventually becoming fully developed and mature, that will lead humanity to immortality. Already within itself, physical love bears the death-defeating force, the seeds of life and immortality. Our task is to realize in full what now exists only as an ideal in Plato and in potential in our everyday lives. Wholeness, all unity in love, means androgyny. The separation of sexes and sex roles is, for Solovyov, the most important aspect of the disintegration of humanity that was a major theme of Fedorov's, though Fedorov certainly did not call for androgyny as a solution. The true human being, Solovyov writes, in the fullness of its ideal personality, obviously cannot be merely a man or merely a woman, but must be a higher unity of the two. To create the true human being is a free unity of the masculine and feminine elements, which preserve their formal separateness but overcome their essential disparity and disruption, is the direct task of love. Further, in The Meaning of Love, he writes that we must have a part in the reinstatement of God in material humanity. We must tend its growth by our conscious action. The passive receptivity of faith is enough to begin with, but it must be followed by active faith, moral endeavor, and effort in order to preserve, strengthen, and develop the gift of radiant and creative love, and by means of it embody in oneself and in the other the image of God, forming out of two limited and mortal beings one absolute and immortal personality. Idealization of the beloved should not lead merely to admiration of the other, but through active faith, imagination, and creativity, should lead to the transformation of reality to match the ideal image of the other. For Solovyov, love is a powerful creative force, allowing us to transform everyday reality to correspond to a reality that is higher. In the feeling of love, in accordance its essential meaning, we affirm the absolute significance of another personality, and through it of our own. The inevitability of death and the emptiness of our life are incompatible with the emphatic affirmation of one's own and another's personality contained in the feeling of love. Sexual love, which will not be a part of Fedorov's ideal future, will play an important role in Solovyov's universal resurrection. It is self-evident that so long as man reproduces himself like an animal, he also dies like an animal. But it is equally evident that mere abstention from the act of procreation does not in any way save one from death. Persons who have preserved their virginity die, and so do eunuchs, and neither enjoy even particular longevity. Sexual union becomes in Solovyov a step toward the more perfect union of androgynous wholeness. Physical union is a striving toward spiritual union. Eventually, that striving will lead humanity, now suffering from sexual division into male and female, to consciously develop both the masculine and feminine principles now inherent but undeveloped, and in this way to eventually attain wholeness of personality. Only the whole man can be immortal, and if physiological union cannot reinstate the wholeness of the human being, it means that this false union must be replaced by a true union, and certainly not by abstention from all union, i.e. not by striving to retain in status quo the divided, disintegrated, and consequently mortal human nature. Carnal love, now an embodiment of the principle of division, disintegration, and death, is nevertheless a step beyond abstemious solitude toward something higher. The true spiritual love toward which we must direct our evolution will not be a weak imitation of present physical love, not a feeble imitation and anticipation of death, but triumph over death, not the separation of the immortal from the mortal, of the eternal from the temporal, but the transformation of the mortal into the immortal, the reception of the temporal into eternity. False spirituality is the negation of the flesh. True spirituality is its regeneration, salvation, and resurrection. Solovyov then presents his resurrection by love in contrast to Fedorov's technological resurrection. At the same time, he is contrasting his idea of incarnating the spiritual with the Neoplatonic idea of separating the spiritual from the physical. Like Fedorov, Solovyov utterly rejects any notion of a disembodied spiritual paradise. All unity must include matter as well as spirit. Human wholeness must include the masculine and feminine principles balanced in every individual. In divine love in creation, God established his relationship to the other. So when we act in God's image, we must activate our relationship to the other. Love, then, is Solovyov's solution to the problem of isolation, dividedness, fragmentation, emptiness, and death, not Neoplatonic withdrawal. Then, but Christian love, the embracing of matter by spirit, is the essence of the illumination that Solovyov received from Sophia in the desert in 1875, and that informs so much of his subsequent writings. Impenetrability, i.e. mutual exclusion of one's another's true being, is in Solovyov the basis of false existence. For him, true life means living in another as in oneself, or finding in another positive and absolute completion of one's own being. True life has always had sexual, conjugal love for its foundation and pattern. But a transformation of sexual love to a higher plane first requires a transformation of the entire external environment. Individual life must be wholly integrated into social and cosmic life. The perfect relationship of the one and the many, the part and the whole, the individual and society, the body and spirit, must be what Solovyov calls a living, syzygic relation. Not to submit to one's social environment and not to dominate it, but to be in loving interaction with it. That is the relation of the true human personality, not only to its immediate social environment and to its nation, but to humanity as a whole. Solovyov envisions a gradual spreading of syzygic interpenetrating relationships and a gradual diminution of separation and impenetrability. And here his idea comes as close as it ever will to Fedorov's idea of the end of divisiveness and the coming of all unity. Like Fedorov, but without specifying a scientific technological aspect of that task, Solovyov projects his own vision of eternal universal immortality in order that separation and impenetrability should be absolutely abolished altogether, and all individuals, both past and present, should finally become eternal. The process of integration must transcend the limits of social or strictly human life and include the cosmic sphere from which it started. In this sense, it is essential to change man's relation to nature. He must enter with it, too, into the same relation of syzygic unity, which determines his true life in the personal and social sphere. Even though Solovyov includes the ancestors, the past, and the cosmos in his idea of syzygic love, Fedorov still takes him to task for creating the resurrection project as a mystical, philosophical, and religious idea, instead of emphasizing immediate practical tasks to be undertaken. A syzygy is not an agenda for action. But Solovyov did indeed spend several years in a futile attempt to bring about a first practical step toward the spiritual unification of humanity, his efforts toward a reconciliation of the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Fedorov, we recall, wrote that after finding no positive response to the resurrection project among the students at St. Petersburg University, Solovyov in the next year became a Catholic. And indeed, Solovyov's attempts to establish dialogue with Bishop Strassmayer and other Catholic high officials have unfortunately been interpreted by many Russian critics as a renunciation of orthodoxy and an embracing of its Western rival. And a question that biographers long debated was whether Solovyov died a Catholic renegade or an Orthodox Russian reconciled with the true faith. In Solovyov's view, he was a true Orthodox believer all his life, and there could be no inconsistency between his orthodoxy and his ecumenism. The unity of Eastern and Western Christians would serve as an important first step towards the unity of all humanity, which he assumed should be the goal of all Christian thought and activity. The Church, for Solovyov, even in its broken, fallen form, represented the feminine, earthly body of the principle of divinity and must be reinfused with spirit, not further fragmented or abandoned. Wholeness and inclusiveness were Solovyov's principles, and this part of his thought, along with his idea that neither submission nor dominance but syzygy should define our relationship to nature, all might make Solovyov's comprehensive worldview more acceptable than Fedorov's to many readers today. A very important but often overlooked part of Solovyov's writings in his work as a poet. He began to write non-juvenile poetry as a very young boy, but his most significant poems date from the mid-1870s, when he was in his early 20s, and continue into 1900, the last year of his life. Throughout his poetry, the self-image he projects is not so much the standard one of a lover seeking his beloved, but rather that of a male friend waiting for Sophia, his female friend and benefactress, to appear. He is on this shore, she is from elsewhere, beyond, Russian Nezdeshnaya, not here, known by flower petals and other tokens, by memories of her from other places, other times, other lives. He speaks as a mortal poet, an ascetic devotee, gifted with a clairvoyance and a view that penetrates the world of matter. She is a queen, a goddess, an empress, Tsaritsa, the eternal feminine. In a few poems she is Isis, Eurydice, Beatrice, a resplendent seven-crowned figure in an icon, but most of all Sophia, in both her aspects as wisdom of God and as soul of the world, third person of the Trinity. Within Solovyov's system, Sophia could be interpreted as his own unrealized feminine half, real, intuited, sensed for brief moments, but not yet fully materialized and present. Solovyov calls to her and speaks to us in a voice unique for its combination of earnest, lofty sincerity and modest self-deprecation. The slightly humorous, self-satirizing tone he uses when discussing the very subjects he cherishes most appears partly from a natural modesty, partly from a desire not to sound preachy or pedantic, and partly as a gesture of self-defense, out of fear that the ideas dearest to him might seem ridiculous to others. But humor also sometimes seems to be used in its Gnostic function as luminous substance, one of the passions that created the material world, the laughter of the Christos as the moment of the crucifixion. A constant theme running from the very early poems to the very late ones is a sense of awe and this presence of unseen but clearly felt presences from another world. Often this is a benign presence, but sometimes it is a malignant presence. Demons, monstrous entities, rents in the sky, underwater movements, underground fires. Another frequent theme is the mystical union, the syzygy, such as the esoteric wedding of the lily and the rose in Song of the Orpheite, or the marriage of azure and gold in his invocations to Sophia. In his poems generally, he works into vivid and often memorable images, the universe of unseen realities that he treats discursively in his philosophical works. Like Fedorov, Solovyov was a lifelong ascetic bachelor. His many female acquaintances, friends, and followers included the widow of the poet Alexei Tolstoy, who supported his occult interests and at whose estate he lived as a guest for some months, most years, and the mysterious Anna Schmidt, whom Solovyov met only once, in the last year of his life, but who pestered him at length with letters and manuscripts claiming that she was earthly embodiment of Sophia and that Solovyov was an incarnation of Christ. In photographs taken from his last years, Solovyov does have the look of an exhausted, infirm, perhaps even haunted prophet, one who, though not yet even 50, had lived too long and seen too much. The poet Andrei Bely described him at this time. His enormous, fascinating gray eyes, his bent back, the long, weak arms, his beautiful head with gray, ruffled strands of hair, his large mouth with protruding lip, his furrowed face. A giant with powerless arms, long legs, a small body, inspired eyes, a powerless child with a lion's mane. He spent his last days very ill at the home of his close friend and follower, Prince Sergei Chubetskoy, the morning after his arrival. He told Chubetskoy that in the night he had a dream in which he saw quite clearly Li Hung Chang, the Chinese statesman, who spoke to him in classical Greek, telling him that soon he would die. He was distracted but made many jokes, though his memory was already weak and he couldn't recall where he had left his baggage upon arriving in Moscow. Later, his things were discovered in the restaurant of Slavyansky Bazaar. Solovyov's influence on the younger generation of major symbolist poets, eventually on Andrei Bely and Alexander Blok, has often been treated. He gave them their major themes: the higher reality beyond our everyday world, the poet as seer, the symbol as a portal between worlds. His influence on the generation of Russian thinkers and theologians of what has been called the Russian religious renaissance of the first half of the 20th century was equally significant. To them he bequeathed the doctrine of sophiology, the centrality of the eternal feminine in Christian spirituality. Fedorov's influence on these thinkers, in part direct and in part filtered through Solovyov, is also important but less frequently discussed. For like Solovyov himself, such religious philosophers as Bulgakov, Florensky, and Berdyaev are well known for ideas and themes that are not necessarily Fedorovian or cosmist. But also, as with Solovyov, Fedorovian themes and cosmist concerns occupy a sufficiently important position in their writings to justify including them in our discussion of major cosmists. Sergei Nikolaevich Bulgakov, 1871 to 1944. Born into a family of 6 generations of priests in the town of Livny in Orlov province, deep in central Russia, Sergei Bulgakov had a troubled childhood. His father and 2 brothers died from drink, and his mother understandably suffered from emotional disturbances connected with these and other family illnesses and losses. Like Solovyov earlier, at about age 13, young Bulgakov rebelled from his strict religious upbringing and early seminary education. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I gave up the positions of faith without defending them. I accepted nihilism without a struggle." At Moscow University, he studied political economy, and in his first published works proved himself a brilliant Marxist analyst of socioeconomic systems. Early on, he was an active member of the Social Democrat Party, and a close acquaintance of leading socialist activists and thinkers both in Russia and in Germany. But even as he was writing and lecturing from a Marxist perspective, gaining a wide reputation as a Marxist political thinker, he began to question the fundamental premises of Marxism and in 1903 published From Marxism to Idealism. The Damascus moment in his conversion came in Dresden, where one day he stood silently for hours before Raphael's Sistine Madonna, the same painting that had transfixed Dostoevsky a generation before and that had inspired his declaration, "Beauty will save the world." Bulgakov, too, would later, in a major philosophical work, The Unfading Light, assigned to art and beauty a major role in the salvation of the world. Bulgakov's illumination, however, did not lead to reject economics, but rather led him to transform it from a Marxist to a Fedorovian, Solovyovian Christian discipline, from social to spiritual science. In the years that followed, he became not only a religious thinker, but an ordained priest, and in 1922, with Nikolai Berdyaev, Nikolai Losky, Ivan Ilyin, S.L. Frank, Lev Karsavin, and more than 160 other leading Russian intellectuals, he was exiled on one of the special philosophers' ships arranged by high Soviet officials for the exile of undesirable intellectuals, and he was never allowed to return to Russia. First going to Constantinople, then to Prague, he eventually settled in Paris, where he served as dean of St. Sergius Theological Institute until the end of his life. His prolific theological and sophological writings, which had led to his expulsion from the officially atheistic Soviet Union, also led to charges of heresy and the threat of excommunication from the Orthodox Church. Partly political and partly doctrinal, the charges that Bulgakov had attempted to introduce a heretical fourth hypostasis to the Holy Trinity were eventually refuted sufficiently to allow him to remain dean at the Institute. Among Orthodox theologians, his doctrines remained highly controversial, but as Father Alexander Schmemann wrote of Bulgakov, whatever the ultimate fate of his sophiology, he himself will remain a great and creative thinker who has contributed more than many others towards the direction and the ethos of modern Orthodox theology. And today it's not only Orthodox theologians who find Bulgakov a compelling and relevant thinker. As Charles McDaniel has written in a recent article on resolving conflicts between Islamic and Western cultures, much has been written of the perceived clash between Islamic and Western civilizations and of the need for reconciliation. Sergei Bulgakov left a rich repository of economic thought that philosophically bridges a gap between the rationality of Western market economies and the transcendent awareness of Islamic social structures. Bulgakov's philosophy of economy embraces ideas of freedom even as it recognizes the need for guidance and the essential nature of economic relationships to the preservation of community. By engaging Bulgakov's economic ideas, Westerners can better understand the apprehensions of intellectuals in traditional cultures concerning globalization and the reticence of many Muslims to embrace it. And as another sign of growing interest in Bulgakov beyond Russia, Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was found Bulgakov's thought sufficiently relevant to today's Western spirituality to have edited a collection of his translated writings. Bulgakov's first major work, and the one that best illustrates his cosmist views, is Philosophy of Economy, Philosophia Kozyastiva, 1912, in which the Russian word for economy suggests with its root the ideas of husbandry, landlordship, proprietorship, management, householding. Bulgakov essentially extends the meaning of economy to taking good care of the universe, and its title could be translated The Philosophy of Responsible Ownership. Like Fedorov, Bulgakov sees present nature as material necessity, a force of disintegration and death, and the human task is to take ownership, feel free life from material necessity, and overcome nature and death. The struggle against the antagonistic forces of nature for the purpose of defending, affirming, and broadening life, with the aim of conquering and taming these forces, becoming their master or proprietor, is in effect what, in the broadest and most preliminary fashion, we call economy. Bulgakov's philosophy of economy, then, is in many ways an attractive, eloquent, lucid, systematic, and more modern and realistic version of Fedorov's common task. Like Solovyov in applying the Fedorovian cosmist schematic to the world of social, political, and economic realities. Far from a dismal science, economics for Bulgakov becomes the sacred priestly care of all that God has entrusted to us. Bulgakov finds that both the communist and capitalist economic systems objectify and depersonalize humanity and reduce individuals to mere producers and consumers of objects more valuable than themselves. Both systems deal only with the external man, typical man subject to the mechanisms of market and historical necessity. But for Bulgakov, real life is internal life, that the entire world historical process proceeds from the contradiction between mechanism or thingness and organism, or life, and from nature's effort to transcend mechanism, the principle of necessity within itself in order to transform itself into an organism, the principle of cosmic freedom, the victory of life, or panzoism. But nature cannot accomplish this liberation on its own. Humanity must step in. Thus, economy is the struggle of humanity with the elemental forces of nature, with the aim of protecting and widening life, conquering and humanizing nature, transforming it into potential human organism. The economic process can therefore be described as follows. It expresses the striving to transform dead material, acting in accordance with the mechanical necessity, into a living body with its organic coherence. In the end, the aim of this process can be defined as the transformation of the entire cosmic mechanism into a potential or actual organism, the transcension of necessity through freedom, mechanism through organism, causality through intentionality, that is, as the humanization of nature. Bulgakov would replace theoretical and existing economic systems with a sophic economy, in which the world soul rather than world matter, the internal rather than the external life of humanity, the unseen rather than the tangible, would be the primary field of operation. Bulgakov extends the meanings of basic economic terms. Wealth becomes cultural and spiritual as well as material riches. Labor becomes the production of culture and the creation of immaterial value as well as industry and agriculture. Consumption becomes the human internalization and spiritualization of the cosmos. Labor is good for man in that it allows one to get out of the prison of self, to overcome separateness. The capacity for labor is one of the characteristics of a living being. It expresses the flame and sharpness of life. Only he lives fully who is capable of labor and who actually engages in labor. The interrelatedness of everything in the universe, physical and spiritual, means that economic activity is cosmic in scope. Every living organism as a body, as organized material, is inextricably connected with the universe as a whole. For the universe is a system of mutually connected and mutually penetrating forces, and one cannot disturb so much as a grain of sand destroys so much as an atom, without to one or another degree disturbing the entire universe. This inextricable connectedness, this holistic relationship, extends beyond the familiar world and beyond this present life. There is a certain cosmological karma of essences. The unity of the universe, the physical communism of being, means that physically everything finds itself in everything else. Every atom is connected with the entire universe. Or if we compare the universe to an organism, we can say that everything enters into the makeup of the world body. This is Bulgakov's variation on Fedorov's idea that all matter throughout the universe contains the particles of our ancestors. For the universe is characterized not only by general correspondence, a continuity and connectedness of the world of physical matter, but also by a certain relation between living or organized matter and non-living or dead matter, or in other words, between organic bodies and inanimate matter. And the general relation between the two fields is that the kingdom of life constantly intrudes on the kingdom of non-life, seizes and carries away cold, lifeless matter with its warm tentacles, and transforms it into living material, organizes dead matter into a living body. Bulgakov's concept of the relationship between life and death is perhaps more profound and certainly more mystical than Fedorov's. Life is death and death is life. Such is the formula of this identity. In more complete and developed form, it would be expressed thus. Life passes into a state of lifelessness, or death, that is new or transcendent to it, while the lifeless or dead is raised into a different higher state of life that is also transcendent to it. Bulgakov asks, what is dominant, life or death? Is life a part of death, or is death a part of life? And what is more real, more primordial, more substantial, life or death, the living or the dead principle? Following the ancients, Plato in particular, Plotinus, Bohm and Bader, Schelling and Vladimir Soloviev, again, pardon my Russian pronunciations. I consider this monism of life panzoism in contrast to the monism of death, or the panphantism of the materialists, to be the single metaphysical hypothesis capable of resolving this difficulty. For Bulgakov, closer on this point to Fedorov than Soloviev, the body is essential to life, and a bodiless existence is unthinkable. A body is matter in organized form, and it is only through bodies and organization of organs that life overcomes dead matter. Through the body, thanks to the connectedness of the universe, life in its various manifestations penetrates into the entire cosmos. The cosmos is in this sense the potential body of a living being, an organism in potential. This potential, of course, may never be realized or may be realized only in part. It exists in a dual sense. The idea of potential here is important. The cosmos as it exists is not yet an organism, but human labor can, but not necessarily will, make it so. So like both Fedorov and Solovyov, Bulgakov assigns humanity a crucial active role in the transformation of dead matter into living organism. The difference is primarily one of emphasis. In Bulgakov's emphasis is on the potential for sophic healing of the world's body. Fedorov's emphasis was on the deficiency of everything existing and on the duty to resurrect, the task of transforming, the universal obligation, an all-or-nothing proposition with dire consequences if we fail. Solovyov's emphasis was more on the desirability than on the absolute necessity of deification and God-manhood, a yearning for a world as it could be, rather than a work order for the world as it ought to be. Bulgakov, closer to Solovyov, but with subtle differences, does not so much yearn as patiently anticipate that Sophic economy will eventually achieve the humanization of nature, the spiritualization of matter, and the resurrection of the dead. Consumption brings the entire universe into ourselves. Our bodily organs are like doors and windows into the universe, and all that enters us through these doors and windows becomes the object of our sensory perception, and in the process becomes, in a sense, part of our body. From the microscopic to the macroscopic, everything apparently dark and lifeless can be understood as an extension of our body. All that is accessible to our cognition and that somehow affects our sensuality and thus enters the illuminated sphere of life. All of this that is potentially the entire universe can become our body, its external peripheral extension. Lifeless things become part of life by our consumption of them into our body. Thus, the entire universe, apparently mechanical and lifeless, can become an organism through our act of realizing it to be an extension of our body. For Bulgakov, the process of consumption represents ontological communication with the world and the basis of all life processes. Life is in this sense the capacity to consume the world, whereas death is an exodus out of this world, the loss of capacity to communicate with it. Finally, resurrection is a return into the world with a restoration of this capacity, through to an infinitely expanded degree. That we are already on the way to humanizing the universe is evident in the simple everyday act of taking a meal. Where Fedorov saw the eating of particles of our ancestors as a form of cannibalism that could only be atoned for by resurrecting them, Bulgakov sees ingestion as part of the solution instead of a problem. The boundary between living and non-living is actually removed in food. Food is a natural communion, partaking of the flesh of the world. When I take in food, I am eating world matter in general, and in so doing, I truly and in reality find the world within me and myself in the world. I become part of it. Food in this sense uncovers our essential metaphysical unity with the world. Incarnation, then, the literal taking into the body in Bulgakov, becomes not only a theological doctrine but a practical everyday activity. The taking of food erases the difference between subject and object, and our act of incarnating the world parallels God's act in becoming man. Even God has to become incarnate in the world in order to act on it from within, as an interworldly resurrective force, and the Word was made flesh. God, the Word, the Logos, moved from outside the world to inside the world in order to bring new life to the world and to save it. Holy Communion, for Bulgakov, enacts the potential of immortality. If food is a means of communion with the flesh of the world, regardless of its shape and quantity, then partaking of Christ's flesh and blood in the form of bread and wine is communion with the flesh of the Son of God, the divinized flesh of the world, which can also be conceived only dynamically. And as food maintains mortal life, so the Eucharistic meal means to partake of immortal life, in which the death is conquered once and for all, and the death-like impenetrability of matter is overcome. Consumption, then, has not only an economic and metaphysical dimension, but a sacred dimension as well. The sacrament of bread and wine, the food of immortality, serves as this transcendent promise of what our ordinary everyday meals, properly understood, could lead us to. Labor is the living connection between the subject and object. The bridge leading into the eye, into the world of realities, and irrevocably connecting them to his world. For Bulgakov, the non-I is really not the not yet I, and what is dead is not yet living. The labor to actualize the potential may take a long time, but the opportunity already exists. As a consequence of the general connectedness of nature, the unity of the cosmos, we must speak of the accessibility or obedience of nature generally to man. Although man remains immeasurably far from possession of nature, this path is open to him. Nature is the passive, receptive feminine principle. Man is the active, male, conscious principle. Thus, nature, with its reigning and blind intellect of instinct, becomes conscious of itself and acquires vision only in man. Nature becomes humanized. It is capable of becoming man's peripheral body, submitting to his consciousness and realizing itself in him. The cosmist idea of active evolution becomes in Bulgakov a function of human labor. Through labor, humanity introduces a new, cosmogonic, world-creating force equivalent to natural force. God originally created the world with Adam, humanity, at the center. And what unfolds in time and constitutes the content of history merely recreates the interconnection and interrelation of the world's elements that was destroyed by the original sin. Bulgakov's man, then, is not a creator but a recreator, and nature as an active force, natura naturans, which in the present world is hidden and suppressed by its phenomena and products, natura naturata, realizes itself in man. Man slowly and gradually freeing himself from slavery to things, the products of the natura naturata, removes the deathly shroud from nature and apprehends its creative forces. In economy and the conscious recreation of nature, we can see a certain adumbration and anticipation of that liberation of the natura naturans from the fetters of the natura naturata, from the imprisonment of thingness, from that heavy numbness in whose solemnance it dreams for its liberation. Humanity is capable of transforming the world, but how do we know that this transformation will be for the better? If the universe is fluid, if even life and death are interconnected, if the most basic boundaries can be redrawn or erased, what will ensure that the magic we work will be good magic? Bulgakov writes, since man obviously is not all-powerful, he cannot create from nothing, but must draw on the existing world in recreating his new artificial world, the world of culture. He can imprint his ideas on the created world, experiment with it, and find in it the answers to his questions. In economic activity, the new world of culture takes shape. But where does he find the images, the model ideas on which to base his creative activity? His answer is, of course, Sophia. Humanity is and always remains the unifying center of the world in the eternal harmony and beauty of the cosmos created by God. The empirical world is immersed in a process, in time and space, in history, and as such is imperfect and disharmonious. Yet, like humanity itself, it is never wholly separated from a higher metaphysical reality, from the divine Sophia that ever soars above the world, illuminating it through reason, through beauty, through economy and culture. Solovyov's Sophia seems to have been more of an ideal, serving as guide and inspiration to a higher life. Bulgakov's Sophia seems to be a more active presence and force, an ally in the human task of realizing the sacred cosmic potential within the given universe of actuality. The world is cosmos and the empirical world. Sophia and humanity maintain a living interaction like a plant's nourishment through its roots. Sophia, partaking of the cosmic activity of the Logos, endows the world with divine forces, raises it from chaos to cosmos. Nature always perceives her reflection in man, just as man, despite his faults, always perceives his reflection in Sophia. Through her, he takes in and reflects in nature the wise rays of the divine Logos. Through him, nature becomes Sophic. Sophic, then, as a term for cosmic interconnectedness and interpenetration, is Bulgakov's equivalent of Solovyov's Syzygic. To recreate nature, we need models, images, icons. By attuning ourselves to models given to us by Sophia, we will reshape the world for the better. If we try to take matters into our own hands and attempt independent choice of other models, outside Sophia, all we could do is shape a shadowy, satanic world alongside the given created one. The illusion that one can create something from and by oneself is a form of hubris that can only result in bad art, bad science, and further degradation of the natural and cultural environment. As many commentators have noted, Bulgakov, like Solovyov, nowhere exactly defines what he means by Sophia. She's in various passages the eternal feminine, the earth mother, the world soul, the earthly manifestation of the Trinity, the substratum underlying human economic activity. Bulgakov describes Sophia's many functions but does not try to pin her down to a single consistent definition. As he explains, Sophia cannot be understood through science, nor through any examination of the phenomena of this world. Sophia can only be known to us through revelation. Truth reveals itself in miraculous, intuitive ways independent of scientific cognition. This revelation can take on different forms: religious as myths and symbols, philosophical as the brilliant intuition of philosophical geniuses, artistic as works of art, through which, according to Schelling's definition, the infinite shines through the finite. Sophia reveals itself finally in the mysteries of personal religious life. Whoever has once experienced the inexpressible knows about this, and whoever has not is incapable of understanding it. For Bulgakov, Christ is the only way, truth, and life, and one who partakes of life in Christ, the truth, becomes a living member of the divine Sophia, the body of Christ, his church, and in so doing apprehends the Sophic world, for as merely an ideal, a living reality, he becomes transparent and Sophic. Sophia, that sun which shines and warms us while remaining invisible, emerges from the clouds and openly stands in the middle of the sky. Here we see the depths, but also the down-to-earth quality of Bulgakov's mysticism. Although at the time a philosopher and a social scientist, he first attained his knowledge of Sophia not by reading or debating or conducting survey, but by standing before Raphael's Madonna, not trying to analyze the painting, but absorbing it, opening himself to the great artist's intuition of higher reality. He came to understand Solovyov through Raphael. To use his terms, he consumed the Madonna. She became part of Bulgakov, and Bulgakov became part of her. Raphael's great vision became an extension of his body and life, and he became an extension of Raphael's vision. In art and deeds, then, is where Bulgakov finds truth, not in spiritual abstractions, but in worldly embodiments of the spirit. Bulgakov's Sophia is not an idea, not a concept, but an active presence sensed by those open to revelation. Another defining feature to Bulgakov's thought that we see here is the honor he pays to the priest's day-to-day work in the world, and to the church as a living, earthly body of God's Word. Probably more than any of the other cosmist thinkers, Bulgakov valued and actively participated in the corpus of the world. As Bernice Glatzer Rosenthal has shown in a Perceptive article, Bulgakov regarded Sophia as a living link between God, man, and nature, with emphasis on the living. He was not an ascetic or in any way removed from the everyday business of living in the world. He was happily married and a devoted father, active in state and church politics. He was an able administrator, and especially in his second major book, The Unfading Light, Svetnovenchi, 1917, exalted the feminine principle, human intimacy, and matrimonial sex. His emphasis is on spiritual corporeality, and as Rosenthal notes, he envisioned the entire world as one corporeality and one body. Rosenthal cites a remarkable passage from The Unfading Light. Great Mother, great Earth, in you we are born. You feed us, we touch you with our feet, to you we return. Children of the earth love their mother, kiss her, wipe her tears, because they are flesh and blood. For nothing perishes in her. She preserves everything in herself. The silent memory of the world that gives life and fruit to all. He who does not love the earth, does not feel her maternity, is a slave and an alien, a pitiful rebel against the mother, a fiend of non-existence. You silently preserve in yourself all the fullness and all the beauty of creation. Where Fedorov's ideal was virginity, and Solovyov's was androgyny, Bulgakov believes in holy matrimony, with emphasis on the holy. His church is the bride of the Lamb, and earthly human relationships are reflections of that higher one. Male and female, he created them. Bulgakov accepts traditional gender roles of active masculinity and feminine passivity. But as Rosenthal observes, he generally exalts the feminine over the masculine. In effect, he was invoking Mother Russia against the German fatherland, the feminine qualities against masculine ones, love rather than force, mediation rather than conflict, and selflessness rather than self-assertion, aggressiveness, and war. The abstract rationalism he hated is conventionally linked with a masculine style of thought, and war has always been a masculine affair. Orthodoxy, he pointed out, stresses motherhood and glory of the earth. The world rests in the bosom of God as a child in the womb of its mother. His dead son was resting in Mother Earth. In the Holy Grail, Sviatyi Graal, a poetic exegesis of John 19:34, the passage about the piercing of Jesus' body by the spear of Longinus and the flow of blood and water from the wound, Bulgakov further develops the idea of Christ's bond with the world. For Bulgakov, the Grail legend in which Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood and water from the wound in the same chalice that had been used in the Last Supper, and took the chalice to Glastonbury in England, where it became the object of Arthurian quests, a symbol of holiness and spiritual beauty intermittently visible only to the purest knights. The Arthurian legend has its own origin and inner meaning, Christ's gift of himself to the world. The Grail is the world, the earth, into which flowed the living corporeality that was separated out from the spirit-abandoned body of Christ on the cross. Bulgakov further notes that in Orthodox iconography, the blood from Christ's wounds falls into the earth and quickens the skull of Adam, buried under the cross on Golgotha. Out of the side of the old Adam was created woman, who tempted him to fall. But the wound delivered to humankind from Adam's side is healed by the spear wound in Jesus' side. The blood and water that flowed into the wound abide in the world. They sanctify this world as the pledge of its future transfiguration. And the whole world is the chalice of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is inaccessible to veneration. In its holiness, it is hidden in the world, from the world. However, it exists in the world as an invisible power, and it becomes visible, appears to pure hearts who are worthy of its appearance. In one of the first assessments of Fedorov's thought by a major thinker, Bulgakov finds his emphasis on universal kinship and on Christianity as an active faith to be among the highest achievements of Russian thought. But like Solovyov, he rejects the technological side of Fedorov's project, considering it the apotheosis of economic materialism. He argues that Fedorov's active Christianity overemphasizes the potential of humanity by itself and slights the active presence of God in the world. For Bulgakov, Fedorov lacks appreciation of the mystery of God's relationship to humanity and the world. Bulgakov accepts that so long as we remain human in this world, much remains and will remain unknowable, whereas Fedorov believes that we all can and must eventually know all. Bulgakov says that Fedorov does not clearly understand, or at least never clearly states, what life is and what death is, and ignores the reality intuited by all Christian mystics, that a person's life already extends beyond the body's death. This world, as Bulgakov apprehends it, suffused with Sophic presence and activity, already contains the potential of its redemption and divine human cooperation, with emphasis on the divine, can eventually realize the potential. As an active priest, Bulgakov emphasizes the simple sacraments and daily pastoral care, which in his view can perform magic beyond any scientific technology. Bulgakov's contribution to cosmist thought is to emphasize the active aspects of Christian orthodoxy as it already is, and not as it must transform itself to become. In Bulgakov, the liturgy of transformation, properly understood, happens within the existing church, and the existing world is the body in and through which Sophia is manifest. We are the owners and managers of the cosmos, responsible under divine guidance for its survival and growth. In Bulgakov's economy, we need to apply more care and understanding than radical redirection. We do not need to build or purchase a new universe, but to take better care of the one we already own. Pavel Alexandrovich Florensky, 1882 to 1937. Although many of the Russian cosmists were polymaths, probably no one deserves to be called the Russian Leonardo more than Pavel Florensky, whose wide-ranging seminal contributions to mathematics, physics, electrodynamics, folkloristics, philology, marine botany, art history and theory, earth science, philosophy, theology, and esotericism were all part of his lifelong quest for the comprehensive worldview, uniting science, religion, and art, reason, and faith. Orthodox tradition and futuristic thaumaturgy. Of Florensky, Sergei Bulgakov, friend and soulmate, forever paired with him in a famous dual portrait by Mikhail Nestorov, wrote, "Of all the contemporaries whom I was fated to meet over the course of my long life, he was the greatest." And the composer, musicologist, and scholar of mysticism Leonid Sabnaev would add, "Florensky is one of those persons in my life who made the deepest impression on me, owing to the intensity and profundity of his intellect, which amounted to unquestionable genius despite his propensity to paradox and contradictions." He was a man quite unlike any other. A North American branch of the Russian Orthodox Church has even listed him as a martyr and saint. But as we shall see later in this chapter, for other sides of his life and thought, Florensky has been labeled a Neanderthal and a cow, an apologist for the Black Hundreds, a 20th century Savonarola, and has recently even been branded a forerunner of Adolf Hitler and the most vehement Nazi racists. Contradictions, antinomies, and paradoxes pulse through Florensky's life and thought. Born in an obscure railway town in Azerbaijan, schooled in Tiflis 3 years after Asobeb Dzhugashvili, who would change his name to Stalin. No one, Bulgakov tells us, loved Russia more, yet was less of a Russian nationalist than Florensky, who knowing exactly what he was in for, stayed to suffer imprisonment, labor camps, and eventual execution, rather than seek comfort in probable fame in emigration. His father was Russian, a railway engineer, interested in all sciences, well-read in European literature, neither religious nor anti-religious, but tolerant and glad to include religious holidays as an important part of the family culture. Florensky's paternal grandfather was a doctor, descended from a long line of priests, but like many of his generation of similar background, a militant 1860s positivist, socialist, and atheist. Florensky's mother was thoroughly Russified, a daughter of a prominent, but in the words of biographer Avril Pyman, decadent, effeminate, Armenian trader of fine wools and silks. In St. Petersburg, where she met her Florensky's father, she used the Russian version of her surname, Saparova, instead of Saparian, and after marriage was known as Olga rather than by her Armenian name Salome. She loved European art, music, and poetry, and had little to no interest in things Armenian, somewhat to Florensky's later disappointment when he attempted to learn more about the Armenian half of his ethnic heritage. Despite Florensky's thoroughly Russian cultural background, some acquaintances, such as Sabanev, remarked on his, quote, Asiatic appearance and Oriental cast of mind. Bulgakov thought that he looked somehow un-Russian, more ancient Greek or Egyptian. The symbolist, poet, novelist, and memorist Andrei Bely, under whose father, the mathematician Nikolai Bugaev, Florensky studied at Moscow University, wrote, "Florensky should be drawn in Egyptian outline. At his feet I would put a crocodile." In ethnicity and culture, in intellectual interests, in every way imaginable, Florensky was a walking example of unified contraries. The one image that perhaps best illustrates his natural complexity is of him standing in a classroom after the 1917 revolutions, probably beside a bust of Lenin, lecturing on theoretical and practical technicalities of electrification to young workers and Bolshevik officials, while still wearing his white priest's cassock. His religious piety, his devotion to medieval Russian traditions and values, and his dedication to Soviet scientific, social, and technological projects were all equally genuine. As Bulgakov explains, he was a citizen of both Athens and Jerusalem. He was indifferent to politics and inwardly free from all forms of external government, ready to serve God and Russia however and wherever he could, whether as monk or married priest. Whether in the monastic village of Sergiev Posad or in Siberia, whether before or after October 1917, his focus seems to have been 3/4 on eternity, 1/4 on the present moment. In 1900, during the first year at the University of Moscow, he wrote to his mother, "For me, mathematics is the key to a worldview." And in his third year of study, his approach to mathematics and the worldview he found in it had become so well developed that a later scholar would write, "Arithmology is P.A. Florensky's philosophical method and pervades his entire oeuvre." In the narrow sense of the word, arithmology is the theory of discontinuous functions. In the wider sense, it's the idea of discontinuity, an integral factor, according to Florensky's judgment, of a whole new way of looking at the world, which was then in process of formation, which was just coming into being to replace various types of analytical ways of thinking based on the concept of the continuum. Eventually, this mathematical concept of discontinuity would be extended to any number of non-mathematical applications. And Lobachevsky's non-Euclidean geometry would become a model for a worldview based on revolutionary premises and radically untraditional logic. Florensky believed that the mathematics of continuity formed the basis for the 19th century determinism and materialism that new thought needed to overcome. The mathematics of discontinuity now serve as a foundation for alternatives to the deterministic materialism that dominated all fields of thought and culture. The logic of discontinuity allows Florensky to argue that instead of accepting that truth is either something or its negation, A or negative A, truth must instead be considered both something and its negation, A plus negative A. The thing and its contradiction, the thing and its opposite, the thing and its other, all join as part of one truth that is greater than the other. So in Florensky's discontinuous worldview, one thing does not counter or replace its opposite, but joins with it, neither part losing its identity, to form something higher and greater. The cosmos, for Florensky, is united and whole in a way that is beyond our comprehension. We cannot grasp the unified wholeness, but only seize upon individual strands of the whole truth, and therefore cannot assure that because one thing is certainly true, then its negation, opposite, or contradiction must be untrue. Florensky's view looks away from the mechanical world order, forward toward our fluid, mysterious universe of matter and antimatter, waves that are also particles, and subatomic whatnots that are simultaneously there and not there. And Florensky applies this concept of discontinuity to everything he writes about icons, ethnic customs, or electrons. Some of Florensky's strongest critics have possibly misunderstood his intentions, have assumed that because he wore a priest's cassock while lecturing to workers, he was protesting the revolution and rejecting the Soviet order, or because he worked for Soviet institutions, he'd abandon his religious calling, that because he was taking a clear stand for A, he must obviously be taking an equally clear stand against A. Negative A. His critics have argued that his discovery and endorsement of certain higher truths in the Ptolemaic worldview must mean that he rejected the Copernican. His love for everything about medieval Russia must mean he despised everything about the Italian Renaissance. That he valued the reverse perspective of Russian icons means that he must have found Raphael's work ugly, without form or soul, bezobrazny. But it is likely that his intention was less to denigrate or reject the realities and values of the present time than, while abiding the given world, to rediscover and revive higher truths and values that had been forgotten or were being neglected. Complete truth equals A plus negative A. The Florensky's role was to demonstrate to those who knew only the truth of A that negative A could also be true. So, to a neo-Kantian intellectual world, in which human reason is autonomous and truth does not determine consciousness, but rather consciousness determines truth, Florensky exalted Plato's magical religious world of more real verities, and in the face of an aesthetic dogma that places the beginnings of realism art in the Italian Renaissance, Florensky points out that the higher realism of the great Russian icon painters, who not naively but knowingly and deliberately use reverse perspective, with planes and angles, allowing the Savior's eyes and nose to point toward the viewer, while the neck and chin turn slightly sideways, to depict the world from a higher, wider, rounder, godlike point of view, rather than from the individual artist's narrow, temporally and spatially limited viewing angle. Whereas a well-painted Renaissance portrait gives us an image, Russian obraz, of our physical reality from a limited, individualistic, illusory perspective, a well-painted icon, when viewed by the right person, a sensitive believer, in the right setting, an irregular, round, and cornered Russian church interior, with a sight and aroma of drifting incense dimly lit by flickering candles, accompanied by the slow choreographed movements of priests in folded, rich, flowing vestments, allows the viewer to behold something like Plato's world of ideal forms. Here we recall that Vladimir Solovyov, in his poem Three Meetings, and Alexander Blok in his beautiful lady poems, set their epiphanies of a higher Platonic sacred reality in church atmospheres, very similar to those described by Florensky. Florensky tells us that when viewed in a museum under bright, cold light, an icon closes its window to higher reality. In pointing this out, Florensky is not so much suggesting that we should stop supporting and visiting museums, but rather that there is more to reality than we can experience even in the best institutions of our modern secular culture. Moreover, as he argues in this essay and elsewhere, anything removed from its living environment loses much of its value and meaning. We can try to abstract truth from experience. We can read books about, for example, a higher reality, but we can truly know it only by experiencing it whole in life, embracing the living discontinuities, irrationalities, and contradictions. Like Fedorov before him, Florensky rejected the doctrine of progress and believed that as much was lost as gained, as Russia followed in the wake of European transitions from medieval to Renaissance to Enlightenment to industrial societies. As Michael Hagmeister points out, the Middle Ages for Florensky represented principles of objectivism as opposed to subjectivism, collectivism as opposed to individualism, wholeness as opposed to atomization, synthetic as opposed to analytic vision, constructive as opposed to self-destructive ideals. Florensky sometimes openly described himself as a medieval thinker and a man with medieval preferences, but that he highlighted what he considered the strengths of the medieval and the weaknesses of the Renaissance and post-Renaissance worldviews does not mean that he saw a black and white history of no weaknesses in the medieval view and no positive features in later periods. His view of history was not so much one of linear decline leading to fall as of general characteristics that submerge for a time, and then resurface, never taking the exact same form, but reappearing with recognizable similarities. To some degree, Florensky believed that the communist future could possibly, but not necessarily, lead to a revival of medieval objectivism, collectivism, and constructive vision, and a turning from the illusory individualism and self-destructive atomization that had characterized pre-revolutionary modernity. As his acquaintance Leonid Sabanev saw it, he seemed to look upon the Bolsheviks from some mystical height, as a necessary link in the historical process. His medievalism was neither a nostalgic yearning for the past nor a total rejection of the present, but a nuanced, guardedly hopeful vision of revival of certain characteristics, even with a difference in the future. Florensky's brilliant start as a mathematician, making him at an early age a leading figure in a movement subsequently recognized as a major revolutionary force in the history of international mathematics, could have led to a productive and distinguished academic career. But like Solovyov before him, Florensky turned to the study of theology, not abandoning science for religion, but joining A to negative A, adding profound immersion in orthodox spirituality to his previous precocious accomplishments in mathematics and natural science. After passing his master's examination at the Moscow Academy of Theology, He accepted a position there as lecturer in philosophy, and in 1914 published his dissertation and best-known work, The Pillar in the Ground of the Truth. A brilliant if eccentric, or as Berdyaev would later label Ground of the Truth, label it, a stylized collection of 12 letters to an unidentified, meek, and radiant friend that had become a classic of Russian spiritual literature. One of the major ideas developed in the letters of the consubstantiality, which Florensky treats as a Christian antinomian alternative to modern secular materialistic rationalism. That three can be one as a rational and material absurdity, but a higher spiritual truth, exemplifying an epistemology that is not only a gnosiological, but also an ontological act, not only an ideal, but also real. Knowing is a real going of the knower out of himself, or, what is the same thing, a real going of what is known into the knower, a real unification of the position of Russian and in general of all Eastern philosophy. Thus, knowing in Florensky is like consumption in Bulgakov, an act of love, earthly and heavenly, a going out of oneself and a taking into oneself of another. This is the moral dimension of Florensky's epistemology, the importance that he assigns to the idea of friendship. To his own life, Florensky, who, as Bulgakov once remarked, was in his personal life as solitary as Mount Elbrus, intended to live as a monk, but was advised by his religious superior to marry instead and become a priest in the world. His previous intellectual and spiritual intimacies had all been with males, giving rise to suspicions then and now of homosexual inclinations, and those close of him were astonished to learn of his sudden decision to marry. As longtime friend Vladimir Ern wrote of his own wife on September 2nd, 1910, Pavlushka has got married. I called in on him as dusk was falling. We embraced, and without a word he showed me his ring. I was thunderstruck, but he called out Anna and introduced us. Vasenska, Vasily Anna's brother, a friend of Florensky's from the Theological Academy, appeared. We sat down to tea, everything so easy and simple, and I sat there in amazement, trying to take in the fait accompli. She behaves affectionately to Vasily and calls him thou. I look at her face. His sister. It's 3 days since she arrived from Ryazan, and when they were wed I don't know. Pavlushka is quiet, calm, and merry, natural and tender with his wife, without any sign of being in love, as though they'd been living together for 20 years. And so it's happened. But all my fears are dispersed. Nothing tragic, everything very simple and good. The old, complex Pavel has died down, and it seems he took this step without forcing himself. There will be children to whom they will be devoted, and there will be one more close-knit family in Russia. She's very like Lila, one of Florensky's sisters, not pretty at all, but obviously unassuming, good-natured, simple, and perhaps very beautiful in soul. The marriage, making up in love for what it lacked in romance, did indeed turn out to be a happy one. For the rest of his life, Florensky remained a devoted husband and father, sending whenever possible playful, loving, reassuring messages to every member of the family through the worst times of his exile and imprisonment. Florensky's natural inclinations may have led toward a kind of figurative levitation up and away from everyday earthly realia and into a world of platonic realiora. His role as married priest provided, among other things, ballast, allowing him to embrace both Anna and divine Sophia, to dwell simultaneously in visible and invisible worlds. As early as 1904, through his friend, the son of his mathematics professor, the poet who wrote under the name Andrei Bely, real name Boris Bugayev, Florensky had entered the elite circles that created Russia's silver age of culture. He knew the writers, artists, musicians, and thinkers, attended the salons and discussion groups, and contributed poems, reviews, scholarly, philosophical, and theological essays to the journals that defined the epoch. Here, as always, he was seen as a leading figure, a master theorist of the avant-garde, formulating in mathematical, philosophical, and theological terms the revolutions that were taking place in all the arts, from traditional to experimental forms, and from realist to symbolist themes and images, from Newtonian to Einsteinian, from Earth-centered to cosmist views of the world. with Dmitry Merezovsky, Zenaida Gippius, Andrei Bialy, Vyacheslav Ivanov, Alexander Scriabin, and others. He was at the forefront of the God-Seekers, Prometheans, New Argonauts, and eventually the Makovets, groups with different names and members, but all looking to discover or create a new unity of all art, science, and spirituality. As Bialy would write, one of the tasks that his generation of artists and thinkers set for themselves was to update and apply to the circumstances of the new century the 19th century ideas of Vladimir Solovyov and Nikolai Fedorov. One of Florensky's major contributions to this effort was his attempt to establish a legitimate role in Orthodox theology for the worship of the divine Sophia. Bulgakov acknowledged Florensky's writings as a major influence of his own developing sophiology, and Florensky's creative discourses on the early fathers and features of the Orthodox tradition, particularly the exaltation of the feminine principle, helped Silver Age intellectuals discover new depths in rituals and artifacts previously ignored or dismissed. In Letter 10, Sophia, of the Pillar and Ground of the Truth, Florensky explores concepts and images of Sophia from before Christianity, though Christian doctrine and iconography up through the writings of Vladimir Solovyov, and concludes. Sophia, the true creation or creation in the truth, is a preliminary hint of the transfigured spiritualized world as the manifestation, imperceptible for others, of the heavenly and the earthly. This revelation occurs in the personal, sincere love of two, in friendship, when to the loving one is given, in a preliminary way, without ascesis, the power to overcome his self-identity, to remove the boundaries of his I, to transcend himself, and to acquire his own I in the eye of another, a friend. Friendship, as the mysterious birth of thou, is the environment in which the revelation of truth begins. Sophia, then, as we experience her, is our hint of the heavenly in the earthly. This is our perception and experience of the world's soul. And for Florensky, we cannot really know Sophia, the soul of the world, rationally or by means of definitions and concepts, but only through living experience, through friendship and love. It's through our souls, not through our minds, that we grasp Sophia, the soul of the world, and the holistic truth that she represents. Solitude cannot lead to truth for Florensky. Only through a friend and other can we enter the cosmos and be entered by the cosmos. As in all writings on Sophia, so in his writings on other topics, Florensky's real interest and focus is on the window between two worlds. In Iconostasis, he writes of the icon and the saint's face as windows, objects in our world that allow hints and provisions of another world. And in an essay titled The World as Magic, Magiczne Słowa, he defines the word as an intermediary between the inner and outer world, as an amphibian, living both here and there, a thread between this world and that. Before we are able to speak, the word is only inside our heads, and as soon as we can speak, we no longer have control over it. Paradoxically, then, while we have power over the word, it does not, strictly speaking, exist. And when it emerges from us and does exist, we no longer have power over it. As in the wise folk saying, a word is a sparrow, let it go, you can't catch it. And like Fedorov before him, Florensky suggests that the folk knowledge behind this saying shows more wisdom than all previous learned scientific discourses on the subject. The magic in the word, like the magic in icons, is due to its moving in two directions. In the first place, from the speaker out into the world, and in the second place, from something in the outer world entered the listener's inner world. To put it another way, life is metamorphosed by means of the word, and by the word life acquires spirit. Or to put it yet another way, the word is magical and the word is mystical. To consider the word as magic means to understand just how and why by the word we can act upon the world. And to consider just how and why the world is mystical means to clarify for oneself the doctrine according to which the word is the reality it signifies. In the world of everyday material reality, the signifier and the signified are not identical. The word shoe is not a shoe. But in the higher world of ultimate all-unity, according to Florensky, the signifier and the signified are mystically joined. The seed and energy of the thing can mystically inhere in the word for that thing. In ancient Egyptian religion and in the ancient Hebrew Kabbalah, God and the name of God are one. In yogic practice, a god's name repeated as a mantra mystically joins the god named. And in name worship, Imyaslavi, an early Russian Orthodox heresy that was resurfacing in Florensky's day, the name of God, when pronounced in the Hashastic Jesus prayer, itself attained a kind of divine status, and the believer uttering, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner," mystically experiences the actual presence of God. The simple formula for name worship was the name of God is itself God. Florensky envisioned a mathematical basis for the mystical belief. As Lauren Graham explains, when a mathematician created a set by naming it, he was giving birth to a new mathematical being. The naming of sets was a mathematical act, just as the naming of God was a religious one, according to the name worshippers. Mathematics, then, for Florensky is creation, and mathematical symbols like words are more than counters for realities, but can act upon and create realities. Pythagoras and St. John the Evangelist represent, for Florensky, revealers of the sacred magical power of the signifier, as number and as logos. In linear history, Athens and Jerusalem may represent differences, but in eternal ultimate reality they are one. Florensky was apparently never able to turn down a request for a preface, or introduction, or contribution to any work or collection of essays being edited by an ally or acquaintance. Even though he was reluctant to get involved in what he knew would be a political and theological controversy, which eventually resulted in riots, anathemas, and troops and gunships threatening heretical monks. Florensky's contribution to the name worship dispute came about in part because he was sympathetic to the practice, but mainly because his friend Mikhail Novoselov had asked him to lend his name and support to a venerable monk who was under attack for having attempted an unscholarly defense of a practice that Florensky had a scholarly, intellectual interest in. Florensky's editorial revisions and crudite introduction to the publication simply fanned the fires of a controversy that he hoped to put out. In the wake of the controversy, he wrote, "It is unbearably painful to me that Imyaslavi, an ancient sacred mystery of the Church, has been dragged out into the marketplace and tossed from hand to hand by people who have no right to it so much as touch it, and who, by their whole makeup, are incapable of understanding it." The attacks on him that accompanied the 1913 to 1915 controversy over name worship convinced Florensky that the Orthodox Church of his day was too much driven by political considerations, too deeply mired in the material world of the early 20th century, too willing to knuckle under to government pressure, and would not be a force for good in the political changes he could see coming. But if his writings on Imyaslavi damaged his relationship with the Orthodox Church of his day, another controversy would more severely injure his future international reputation. In 1911, Menachem Mendel Beliz, a Jewish artisan, was falsely accused of the murder of Andrei Yushensky, a 13-year-old Christian boy. Rituals of blood sacrifice quickly spread, and the charge and a polarizing clamor of extreme anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic accusations ensued. During the trial, one of the experts for the defense, Professor Daniel Kavolson, defended not only Beliz but all Jews, present and past, modern and ancient, from accusations of blood sacrifice. Florensky, perhaps naively thinking that he could inject a disinterested scholarly opinion on the matter, anonymously published an article in a collection edited by his friend Vasily Rozanov under the ominous title "Sense of Sight and Smell in the Jew's Attitude to Blood," arguing that the ancient Hebrews, like nearly all ancient peoples, did indeed practice human sacrifice, and that, as he had suggested in an earlier essay on the Slavophile Komiakov, the Christian sacrament of Eucharist, the symbolic eating and drinking of Christ's body and blood, reflects an antecedent Hebrew ritual of periodically eating the flesh and drinking the blood of human sacrificial victim as an offering to God and the atonement for the community's collective sins. And though he offered no opinion on the specific case of Beliz, who was indeed innocent and eventually acquitted, Florensky suggested that it was entirely possible that this ancient ritual could perhaps, in isolated instances, still be practiced somewhere, perhaps even in Russia, even as late as the 20th century. Other mysterious rituals and customs from ancient times had survived into the present, so why not instances of human sacrifice? And while on the subject, he could not decline to provide an introduction, signed only with a Greek initial, to Novoslav's collection of articles Israel in the Past, Present, and Future, and exchanged a series of letters which Razanov on the subject of Jews and blood, in which he used his mathematical skills to determine how much Jewish blood and with what blood Jewish character traits would remain after so many generations of dilution through intermarriage. As Hermann Geltz points out, in his defense of Florensky's character, in his personal life and in his letters, with the exception of those to Razanov, Florensky shows no signs of anti-Semitism. His interest in the questions of blood rites, ancient rituals, genealogy, and ethnic characteristics were, Geltz argues, scholarly and intellectual. Yeesh. As a person of mixed ethnic heritage himself, his attitude toward people of any background, ethnicity, or religion was that of love, never hatred. But Geltz's defense aside, if Florensky thought that as a scientist he could emerge unscathed from a controversy so marked by labels slinging from all sides, he was naively mistaken. As Everil Pyman notes, blood sacrifice and the importance of genealogy were all very well when Florensky was writing about the Christian churches in his beloved Slavophiles, but his interest in such things took on a very different complexion when he ventured to write about the Jews. His writings on blood and the Jews have done little harm to his growing reputation as a native Russian thinker, but may well prevent his being unanimously acclaimed, as some Russians have proposed, as one of the great European minds of the 20th century. For a short time, Florensky was able to serve as priest in a village some distance from the residence in Sergiev Posad, and with the coming of war in 1914, he served briefly as a chaplain on a hospital train for the wounded. But the press of teaching, administrative, and editorial duties, not to mention responsibilities as head of a growing extended family, and his extremely prolific output as writer and scholar, forced him to give up trying to maintain the social dimension of his spiritual activity. As Bulgakov tells us, Florensky's priesthood became more one of sacramental duties than of pastoral care, and after the February and October revolutions of 1917, he first had to diminish and finally curtail his regular activities as a priest. As a highly regarded mathematician and scientist, he was recognized, valuable national asset during the early years of the Soviet Union. He served in a large number of scientific and educational boards and commissions, lectured on all of the many subjects he was qualified to speak on, wrote hundreds of technical papers, led research expeditions, edited and contributed more than 140 entries to a great encyclopedia of technology, and took on any additional assignment he was offered in order to support his growing family. Reading a chronological list of his activities and publications for the period 1910 to 1930 can only make one wonder how he ever found time to eat, sleep, and breathe. The artist Lev Zegin, who worked with Florensky in the New Arts movement Nakovets, tells of an incident in the early years after the revolution. In 1919, Trotsky was serving as head as Glavel Ektro, making an inspection of the facility while in the laboratory in the basement. Trotsky noticed Florensky, who was wearing his usual white cassock. And that's who? Professor Florensky. Ah, Florensky, I know. He walked up to him and invited him to join a conference of engineers. Only maybe not in that outfit. Florensky replied that he would not remove his priestly garment. It would not appear in street clothes. Okay, you can't. Then do it in that outfit. At the conference, Florensky gave a paper. When he came into the meeting room, you could hear some ignorant remarks. A priest in the room. Florensky's paper was as always pithy and brilliant in delivery. He finished to great applause. In 1922, when Bulgakov, Berdyaev, and more than 200 other intellectuals out of step with the Soviet government were loaded onto one of the so-called philosophers' ships and sent into permanent exile, Florensky stayed in Russia. As Bulgakov would write in his obituary, Florensky was in no way a Russian thinker and accepted inevitable persecution in the homeland rather than material comfort but spiritual misery elsewhere. His first arrest came in 1928, ostensibly on account of his earlier work for the Commission for Preservation of Art and Antiquities in the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery. Accused of being part of a church-sponsored counter-revolutionary monarchist plot, Florensky confessed and took all responsibility upon himself rather than inform on any others, and was exiled to Nizhny Novgorod, where he served only 2 months. Thanks to the intervention of E.P. Peshkova, Maxim Gorky's wife, and other sympathetic science and technology officials. Permitted to return to a position as Director of Science Materials, he continued to publish scientific and technical articles and to write unpublishable chapters toward a great projected but never completed philosophical work on the watersheds of thought. Early in the 1920s, Lenin famously declared that communism equals Soviet power plus electrification of the entire country. Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin supplied the power. Florensky provided major assistance with electrification. But this was only part of Florensky's Promethean Fedorovian cosmist endeavor to bring about a new world in which every aspect of human life would be transfigured. In the arts, he was a central figure in the Makavets movement, in which, as we shall see in Chapter 11, one of the other founders, Vasily Shekrygin, undertook an artistic realization of Fedorov's resurrection and planetary colonization project. In a 1919 article titled Organoprojection, Florensky discusses the projection of artificial organs, continuations of our bodies, to extend human capabilities throughout the cosmos. Projected organs and body parts can operate and act on the world beyond the limits of our present physical bodies. Magic in that circumstance could be defined as the art of altering the limit of the body with respect to its customary location. Many of our present organs are only partly developed, far below the abilities and capabilities that our imaginations can project for them. By a combination of flesh and machinery, we can extend our organs to reach as far as we can imagine, and operations now considered magical can become routine. As we shall see later in this study, recent Russian immortalist concepts of future humans as living machines echo Florensky's ideas of organ projection. A further example of the cosmist dimension of Florensky's thought and activity is evident in the later letter of September 11th, 1929, to the eminent scientist and cosmist thinker Vladimir Vernadsky concerning the idea of the biospheres becoming a noosphere, or planet of thought. Citing both classical Greek and Christian texts, Florensky outlines his theory, both panpsychist and Fedorovian, that spirit inheres in all matter, that the individual mark of a person, like a stamp and an imprint, lies on the soul and on the body, so that the elements of the body, although scattered, can again be identified by their correspondence to the imprint, the safraga, the stamp as belonging to the soul. In such manner, a spiritual force always remains in the particles of the body, its registration, no matter where those particles are scattered and mixed with other matter. And he suggests that interpenetrating the biosphere, or perhaps lying over it, is what he would call the pneumatosphere, a sphere of spirit and culture intimately related to, affecting and affected by the rest of the biosphere. At the present time, he concludes, it may still be premature to speak of the pneumatosphere as a subject for scientific investigation. Perhaps such a question should not even be set down in writing. But the impossibility of a personal conversation has compelled me to express this thought in a letter. Although this was a private letter, Florensky's published writings and essays that could only be kept in the drawer contained ideas that would prove to be as heretical within Soviet culture as the pneumatosphere. One of the charges against him when he was arrested again in 1933 was that he had argued that the mathematical basis for Einstein's theory of relativity provided Kabbalistic proof of the existence of God. The other and main charge was that he had accepted an ideologist for a monarchist-fascist conspiracy, preparing to invite and cooperate with a German takeover of the Soviet Union, supported by monks, priests, and Soviets without Bolsheviks. Again, he confessed to the trumped-up charges and even wrote and signed the presumed organization of the future state, a supposed manifesto and plan for the post-coup government. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, which he began to serve in far eastern Siberia near the Chinese border, and later continued in the notorious far northern camp Solovki. During imprisonment, he was allowed one brief visit from his family, was allowed to correspond with them for the first few years, and was able to continue his scientific work, conducting experiments and publishing papers on permafrost and ice formations in Siberia, and on iodine and seaweed properties and harvesting in Solovki. For a long time, first, no information, then false information was released about his death. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, research into Soviet intelligence files found that he was tried and sentenced to death in November and executed near Leningrad on December 8, 1937. Although the charges against him were false in detail and the punishment was unjust, Soviet officials were correct in judging that Zelensky's loyalties were not to the existing government. But neither were they to the existing world. He was a man who happened to be dwelling in this world but was not of it, part ancient, part medieval, part modern, and even postmodern man, a resident of more than a single dimension in time. Even his earliest acquaintances, who bore him no ill will, recognized his otherness. Raphael Solovyov, a young nephew of Vladimir Solovyov, once remarked to Leonid Sabanev that Florensky looks as if he had already lived 1,000 years, and Sabanev, himself a scholar of esoteric doctrines, noted, "He lived in his own closed, ascetic, intensely intellectual world, and in the world of his secret spiritual exercises. He never talked about it, but when I questioned him, he would give some evasive answer or none at all. Yet I had good reason to assume that he at times engaged in yogic exercises and was well acquainted with Hindu mysticism. In his tastes and psychological attitudes, he seemed close to the early medieval Gnostics, Origen, Basilides, and others, much closer probably than to pure and naive orthodoxy. Whatever esoteric knowledge or powers he may have sought, however, were not directed toward personal Faustian ends. With Fedorov and other cosmists, his interest was in the transformation of the world. In the end, he was like the man in Plato's myth who had seen the sun and breathed the fresh air, but then returns to the cave to enlighten those who have never left, fully aware of how he will be received, ready to endure the fate that awaits him. Nikolai Alexandrovich Berdyaev, 1874 to 1948. Berdyaev begins one of his most important books, The Meaning of the Creative Act, with a characteristically bold statement. The human spirit is in prison. Prison is what I call this world, and given world of necessity. This world is not the cosmos. It is a non-cosmic condition of divisions and enmity, the atomization and falling apart of the living monads of the cosmic hierarchy. Although he denied that he was a Platonic thinker, Berdyaev consistently views the visible mundane world of our necessary daily life as essentially unreal, inauthentic, unfit for free human habitation. The real, authentic, free world is the invisible but imaginable cosmos, which is our divinely human Christian task to create. This is a very different idea of Christianity from, for example, Bulgakov's idea that this world is the Holy Grail, into which Christ's blood flowed, and it is precisely this given world which, in Sophic economy, we should endeavor to manage and carefully tend, but not attempt to co-create. Rebellion, freedom, and creativity are Berdyaev's most important themes. In rebellion, he reworks Nietzsche, in freedom, Dostoevsky, and in creativity, Fedorov, three of the thinkers whose portraits were most prominently displayed in his study at Clamart in France. As he was the best known of Russia's 20th century religious thinkers, often discussed as a major existentialist, Berdyaev's emphasis on rebellion and freedom have frequently been noted. In this chapter, we shall emphasize his Fedorovian concept of creativity as a Christian task. Not to try to label him a total Fedorovian cosmist, he resisted all labels, or to deny his contributions to other tendencies of thought. He refused to admit that he belonged to any philosophical or intellectual school, but to indicate that in addition to all else he accomplished, he contributed significantly to the cosmist worldview. Born into the upper but not uppermost Russian social class, with French, Polish, and Tatar roots, and descended from military and administrative dignitaries, no priests, Berdyaev simultaneously embodied, enjoyed, and rebelled against everything aristocratic in Russia, adored the Russian people whenever he encountered a particular specimen, and loathed the bourgeoisie and the commonplace world it represented. Like Kerensky in his white cassock, Berdyaev addressed boisterous revolutionary gatherings in his best counter-revolutionary attire. Elegantly tailored suits, long manicured fingernails, silk handkerchief, perfectly trimmed beard, pince-nez, and expensive French scent. Initially a Marxist, eventually a Christian, and once wealthy but later indigent, he remained a revolutionary, and even when he could no longer afford it, a dandy. As a young man, he loved to visit the palatial estates of his aristocratic relatives, enjoy their rich food, wines, and cigars, and scandalize everyone present with his energetic radicalism. As a student, he was a very slow, mediocre learner, unable to memorize lines of poetry or arithmetic tables, but a precocious early reader of Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Kant, and Hegel, unable to score above 1 on a 12-point scale for catechism, but able to astonish his tutors and instructors with the maturity and complexity of his analysis of dense discursive texts. As both a writer and a speaker, he was a brilliant polemicist, finding that he could best formulate and articulate his own views in opposition of contrast to the views of others. Even late in life, his friend and biographer Donald Lowry tells us, Berdyaev would offer only a minimal and dull response if asked a direct question. But if an idea of his was challenged, whether by a naive young student or a famous visiting intellectual, he would come alive, eyes flashing, and launch into a brilliant monologue, no matter what the question. The contradictory character he ascribes to the Russian soul, cited at the beginning of this study, was essentially a self-analysis of his own mind. Throughout his life, he would get carried away in argument, shout, point, turn abstract concepts into personal attacks, insult and offend his very best friends, and expel invited distinguished visitors from his house. Over the decades, in Russia before and after 1917, and in emigration in Berlin and Paris, he was at one time friendly or closely associated with nearly every major intellectual of the period. But of all these acquaintances other than family, only two, Andrei Bely and Lev Shestov, escaped the inevitable break in relations and resulting cold shoulder, possibly because Bely returned to the Soviet Union, and Shestov died too soon for relations with Berdyaev to deteriorate. With a few once close friends such as Bulgakov, no decision break occurred, but though they lived in relative proximity, they simply no longer sought each other's company. Several times in the various writings, Berdyaev cites The Angel as 1831 poem written by Lermontov when he was 17. In Dmitry Yablonsky's excellent plain prose translation, an angel was flying through the midnight sky, and softly he sang, and the moon and the stars and the clouds and the throng hearkened to that holy song. He sang of the bliss of innocent spirits in the shade of the gardens of paradise. He sang of the great God, and his praise was unfeigned. In his arms he carried a young soul, destined for the world of sorrow and tears. And the sound of his song stayed, wordless but alive, in the young soul. And for a long time it languished in the world, filled with a wonderful longing, and earth's tedious songs could not replace for it the heavenly sounds. Like the soul born into this world by the angel, Berdyaev longed for another paradisiacal world, remembered in celestial song, and could never be satisfied with the tedious sounds of this world. But Berdyaev goes a step beyond Lermontov's poem. moving from passive yearning to active eschatology, urging the creation of a new paradise, not only as an expression of human freedom and creativity, but because God needs us to complete the work he began. Berdyayev's idea of rebellion manifested itself biographically in his turning first against his aristocratic background to embrace Marxism, then again Marxism to embrace Christianity, and then finally against existing Christianity to embrace a future active Christian life based on freedom and creativity. Before the revolution, he rebelled against the monarchy, after against Bolshevism, and an emigration against anti-Bolshevism. Essentially, Berdyayev's stance was a lifelong rebellion against the given world of perceived necessity, a constant process of freeing his mind from whatever set of ideas would currently fix and constrain it. Whatever exists must be transformed, recreated by man to fulfill God's intent. His biographer tells us that as a homeowner, Berdyaev would neither replace a blown fuse nor build a new fire in his stove. But as a philosopher, he finds that no task is beyond man's creative ability. If the whole universe needs a new fuse, someone will be able to come along and do it. Berdyaev acknowledges that in spirit, although not in specific details, he's closer to Fedorov's active, forceful, masculine Christianity than to the various Sophiologies of Solovyov, Bulgakov, and Florensky. According to Berdyaev, human history can be divided into three epochs. The epic of the law, represented by the Old Testament, the epic of redemption, represented by the New Testament, which fulfilled the Old, and the epic of creativity, which would fulfill both the preceding epochs. The division is similar to, but different in emphasis, from Dmitry Merezovsky and Zinaida Grippius's idea, so influential among the Russian symbolists, of three ages and three testaments: the prehistoric age of the Father, the historic age of the Son, and the coming age of the Holy Spirit. Though Berdyaev for some time not only attended but presided over the gatherings at the Merezovsky-Grippius home, he was not a Trinitarian, and in his writings, unless criticizing Christian dogma, avoids the subject. For Berdyaev, the epic of creativity would not arrive on its own from above, would not be a gift of grace from Sophia or the Holy Spirit, but would develop when rebellious humanity following Christ begins to exercise its freedom from necessity and recreate itself in the universe. Unlike Fedorov, with his specific project of resurrection, or Solovyov with his prescription for God-manhood, or Bulgakov with his plan of Sophic economy, Berdyaev proposes no specific course of action. Sometimes citing the poet Titiev's line, "A thought expresses a lie," Berdyaev deliberately refuses to lay out a plan for action or a specific guide to how a free humanity should exercise its freedom, for he believed that any philosophical roadmap proposed would limit rather than encourage freedom. He did not want his thoughts to ever harden to a new dogma, a new closed system, or any intellectual equivalent of death. Whenever he speaks of the epic of creativity, he remains deliberately vague. In its essence, creativity is painful and tragic. The world, in a sense, is a being. But the tragedy of creativity today is that the result of the creative impulse of this world now is not new life but culture, and all works of culture being static, subject to preservation, but not to change, are dead. The dawn of the creative religious epoch also means a most profound crisis in man's creativity. The creative act will create new being rather than values of differentiated culture. In the creative act, life will not be quenched. Creativity will continue creation. It will reveal the resemblance of human nature to the Creator. Literature ceases to be only literature. It would be new being. Art is transformed into theurgy, philosophy into theosophy, society into theocracy. Berdyaev strongly seconds Marx and Fedorov's insistence that the time of philosophy as reflection has passed and the time for philosophy as action has come. For creative philosophy, truth is not a passive reflection of something. Truth is rather activity in giving meaning to something. The creative epic and creative philosophy are characterized by a new and different gnoseology, which throws light on the relative and partial truth of the old gnoseology under the law. This new and different gnoseology is based entirely upon the idea of man as a macrocosm and the center of the universe. The microcosm, in its creative and dynamic relationship to the macrocosm, knows no fatal separation, no opposition. Man is a relative and an image of the cosmos, not because he is a fraction of the cosmos, but because he is himself a whole cosmos, of one structure with the cosmos. Man, the microcosm, is able to express himself dynamically in the macrocosm. He has the power to create being, to change culture into being. The creativeness is theurgy, God activity, activity together with God. We face the problem of Christian being rather than Christian culture. The problem of transforming culture into being, science and art into a new heaven and a new earth. Along with Marx, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Fedorov, Jacob Boehme was a major source of inspiration for Berdyaev. Early in life, through his elder brother, Berdyaev was introduced to occult literature and mystical thought. As he wrote in his autobiography, Homo Mysticus prevailed in him over Homo Religiosus. I believe in the existence of a universal mystical experience and a universal spirituality which cannot be described in terms of confessional differences. There is more depth and insight in the Gnostic and esoteric type of mysticism than in that which has received the official sanction of the Church and is not suspected of heterodoxy. But as with drink, so with intellectual intoxicants. No matter how deeply he drank of Kantism, Marxism, Nietzscheism, Tolstoyism, Fedorovism, occultism, theosophy, or anthroposophy, he succeeded in remaining sober among the intoxicated. Berdyaev faulted Florensky for being devoted to occultism, but to Bulgakov, Berdyaev's philosophy of creativity seemed demonic, titanic, humanistic, and nearly akin to Antichrist. This criticism is similar to the criticisms of Fedorov's works, which have recently been published. Both Fedorov and Berdyaev were accused of usurping God's powers and assigning them to mankind, of interpreting the kingdom come not as a promise to be awaited, but as something to be created. As Berdyaev insists, it is imperative to bear in mind that human creativity is not a claim or a right on the part of man, but God's claim on and call to man. God awaits man's creative act, which is the response to the creative act of God. Man awaits the birth of God in himself, and God awaits the birth of man in himself. Berdyaev's chief criticism of Fedorov is that the common task of resurrecting the dead seems directed more nearly to restoring the past than creating the future. Recreating detail for detail exactly what was instead of creating a new humanity in a new world. He agrees with Fedorov that death can and must be overcome. I am not prone to the fear of death, as for instance Tolstoy was, but I felt intense pain at the thought of death and a burning desire to restore to life all who have died. But to restore to life means for Berdyaev not necessarily a bodily resurrection, but something more like a completion of an individual's potential spiritual personality. Created beings do not create beings. These are created only by God. Personality is created in God before all worlds. And every attempt on the part of created beings to create being leads only to the production of an automat, a dead mechanism. Such an attempt is always demonic. It is black magic. Adam's fall and the world of necessity have imprisoned and condemned to death the individual's spiritual personality. Creativity for Berdyaev means restoring vitality to the individual's spiritual personality. Freedom and creativity tell us that man is not only a natural but a supernatural being. And this means that man is not only a physical being and not only a psychic being in the natural meaning of the word. Man is a free supernatural spirit, a microcosm. Freedom is the power to create out of nothing, the power of the spirit to create out of itself and not out of the world of nature. Freedom is one's positive expression and assertion is creativity. Free energy, i.e. creative energy, is substantially inherent in man. But man's substantiality is not a closed circle of energy within which everything is spiritually determined. In man's very substantiality, there are bottomless wellsprings. Creative energy is increasing energy, not energy which merely rearranges itself. Berdyaev admits that he sometimes seems to contradict himself. And indeed we find him arguing in one place that everything existing must be eliminated, and in another that well springs within the existing world can supply energy for the world's renewal. If we eliminate everything, do we eliminate the well springs? And if so, where does the renewal come from? In the course of his writings, the theme of self-renewal generally prevails over the early anarchistic calls for total elimination. And in his life, the idea that the true Russian spirit of Christian collectivism, Sobornost, would renew itself from within the prison of Bolshevism led him to break decisively with former friends and associates in emigration who called for an armed invasion of the Soviet Union, believing that the Russian spirit could only be saved from the outside. Unlike Florensky, Berdyaev had no scientific or technical skills that could be put to temporary use in building the new Soviet society. Thanks to Lunarsky, the former aristocrat and later Bolshevik commissar, the science fiction writing revolutionary Bogdanov, and a few other high Bolshevik officials with roots in and some slight lingering respect for the values of the pre-revolutionary high culture. Berdyaev and others were permitted to continue to describe being called from this prison cell in the middle of the night to be interrogated by a Cheka official in a military uniform and a red star. He had fair hair, thin pointed beard, and dull gray and somewhat melancholic eyes. His appearance and manner suggested good breeding and gentleness. He asked me to sit down and said, "My name is Dzerzhinsky." This then was the notorious head of the political police, believed to have much blood on his hands, at whose name all Russia trembled with horror. Before Dzerzhinsky could begin the interrogation, Berdyaev took the initiative. I said to Dzerzhinsky, "Please bear in mind that my dignity as a thinker and writer demands that I speak frankly and plainly." To this, Dzerzhinsky replied, "That is what we expect of you." I then proceeded with my attack and spoke for more than half an hour, giving reasons for my religious, philosophical, and moral opposition to communism, while stressing that I was not concerned with party politics. Dzerzhinsky listened very attentively, from time to time interposing a short remark. After Berdyaev had finished his attack, Dzerzhinsky asked several questions and offered a few comments, first about Berdyaev's views, then about other people. Berdyaev willingly elaborated on his views, but refused to inform on other people. At the end of the session, Dzerzhinsky said he was free to go, but could not leave Moscow without permission, then turned to an associate and added, "It is late and there are plenty of bandits about. Would it not be possible to take Mr. Berdyaev home by car?" No car was available, but a red guardsman did take Mr., not Comrade Berdyaev, and his luggage home on a motorbike. But his relative freedom did not last long. He had been in and out of prisons, both Tsarist and Soviet, many times, but because of his reputation and connections, he had never had to serve a complete sentence. In 1922, Berdyaev, Bulgakov, and some 200 other intellectuals were judged incorrigible. A year earlier, Nikolai Gumilev, a major poet with pre-revolutionary views and sentiments, but who had been trying to work within the new system, was executed on trumped-up charges of armed conspiracy, a fate that could easily have befallen Berdyaev and the others. Instead, they were boarded onto one of those philosophers' ships and expelled from the Soviet Union for life. For Berdyaev, life in immigration, first in Germany then in France, gave only the illusion of freedom. He had not wished to leave Russia, but was not given a choice. In Germany, earlier exiles from Russia assumed that Berdyaev and the other new arrivals would turn out to be Soviet agents. And Berdyaev, who, unlike most of his fellow emigres, believed that the wellsprings of Christian renewal still were to be found within rather than outside communist Russia, encouraged Western recognition of the Soviet Union, met with Soviet officials whom he still regarded as fellow Russians even though they served in the anti-Russian government, and in doing made fresh enemies at every turn. The experience of living through 2 revolutions, civil war, prison, expulsion, hostility, and immigration, and the ultimate horrors of World War II seemed only to intensify the urgency of Berdyaev's call for rebellion, freedom, and creativity. Near the end of his life, he wrote that, while his later books may have been more mature and more nuanced in their formulations, the themes from the meaning of the creative act, his first major book, remained at the core of his life's work and thought. He had never shared the sophiological outlook of Solvanov, Bulgakov, and Florensky, but he did have his own version of love as androgyny. But I have never indulged in what is known as the cult of eternal womanhoods, so dear to many of my contemporaries in early 20th century Russia, when fair ladies in Dantesque or Goethean disguise were so highly popular. I even suspected in myself positive dislike of the feminine, although I was never indifferent to it. I felt particularly inclined towards medieval romanticism as expressed by the troubadours of Provence, who were the first to bear witness to the greatness and nobility of love eros. But the introduction of eroticism into religion, into man's relationship to God, was quite foreign to me. Rather, I was attracted by Jacob Boehm's conception of the androgyne, who marks the ascendancy of integral human nature over sexual differentiation. For Berdyaev, sex, reproduction, and family life stand in the way of personal freedom and creativity. Sex pertains to the genus and love to the personality. I could not help seeing in childbearing something hostile to personality, something that is evidence of the dissolution of personality. The genus may evoke pity, but it cannot inspire love eros. The latter is ultimately incomparable with family life, which is of the genus. Love betokens a victory of personality over genus and sex, which are devoid of uniqueness and individuality. Love eros must and does prevail over sex. When love is strong, it has a depth which reaches out to infinity. Sex, on the contrary, carries within itself the sting of finitude. It fails tragically to retain fullness, and is doomed to remain an isolated, separate sphere of fallen nature. It is this desperate character of sex which is in a measure responsible for the horror of atomization characteristic of modern man. But man must fight against the autonomy of sex. Part of this idea goes back through the late period Tolstoy of the Kreutzer Sonata to Fedorov, who believed that the sex drive represents a malignant natural force in need of human regulation. In the project of resurrection, there would be no sexual relations, no childbirth, or need for reproduction. Contrary to Berdyaev, Fedorov understood the idea of love to represent an expression, not a personality but a family feeling, relatedness, brotherhood, родство. On a biographical level, Berdyev's hostility to the idea of family and genus may be in part a rebellion against his own privileged background, an assertion of personal freedom from an upbringing which he considered to be based on social injustice. In a similar manner, Fedorov's idealization of family in Rod may in part stem from his early sense of being excluded from full family membership. Where Fedorov's most intimate friendships were almost exclusively, Nakrosava being the exception, with males, Berdyaev tells us that he always felt closer to and was better understood by women. Despite a sometimes violent nervous tic that frightened new acquaintances, he was considered to be a handsome man, attractive to women, and as a young man, he tells us, and others agree, he was always in love. But his love affairs and later his marriage were all apparently what the Russians sometimes called immaculate, sinless. We would probably say platonic. Berdyaev, his wife Lydia, and in widowhood his wife's sister Eugenia, lived together as if three loving but strong-willed independent siblings, arguing, joking, encouraging, and supporting one another through decades of changed hardship and sometimes joy. One of the problems Berdyaev raises in the meaning of the creative act is how creativity relates to sanctity. He recalls that Pushkin, Russia's greatest creative genius, and Seraphim of Fedorov, Russia's greatest saint, lived at the same time in the beginning of the 19th century, but essentially lived in different worlds, did not know each other, and never had contact of any kind. Two equally noble majesties of holiness and of genius. They are incomparable, impossible of measurement by one standard. It is as though they belong to two different sorts of beings. The Russian soul may be equally proud of Pushkin's genius and of the saintliness of Seraphim, and it would be equally impoverished if either Pushkin or Saint Seraphim should be taken away from it. And here I pose the question. For the destiny of Russia, for the destiny of the world, for the purpose of God's providence, would it have been better if in Russia of the early 19th century there had lived not the great Saint Seraphim and the great genius Pushkin, but two Seraphims, two saints, Saint Seraphim in the Tambov government and Saint Seraphim in Pskov? Berdyaev notes that Pushkin's religious frailty, his worldliness, sinfulness, and imperfection are all part of his genial creativity, and that if he had been a saint, he would have never written the works that so resonate in the soul of Russia and humanity. Strict churchly logic would argue that Pushkin's worldliness renders his creations worthless for redemption and for the world's salvation. And if personal purification is the only goal, as in yoga, in Christian asceticism, and Tolstoyism and occultism, then that spiritual way must be hostile to Pushkinian creativity. But Berdyaev proposes a broader spiritual way. In the creative ecstasy of the genius, is there not perhaps another kind of sainthood before God, another type of religious action, equal in value to the canonical sainthood? I deeply believe that before God, the genius of Pushkin, who in the eyes of men seemed to lose his own soul, is equal to the sainthood of Seraphim, who is busy saving his. The way of genius is another type of religious way, equal in value and equal in dignity with the way of the saint. Before Berdyaev, other Russian thinkers had wrestled with this problem. In the middle of the 19th century, Gogol, tormented that he could only entertain and not save the souls of his readers, had turned against his own genius, burning his manuscripts and renouncing all published works. Dostoevsky agonized over the relationship between aesthetics and Christian morality, and could not be satisfied at having dramatized great tragic heroes in confrontations, but again and again in Prince Mishkin, Aloysia Karamazov, and Father Zosima, attempted to create a literary icon of the perfectly good, Christ-like man. In his last public appearance, he was still trying to unite literature and faith by depicting Pushkin as Russia's iconic spiritual prophet. And Tolstoy, like Gogol, late in life turned against his own genius and attempted to transform himself from a great writer into a religious teacher. All three of these literary geniuses at one time in their lives considered saintliness to be something higher than creative genius. Creativity is not in itself a valid separate way, but must either give way to or somehow be fused with spirituality. Their view reflects the 19th century Russian impulse to seek social or spiritual utility in art. Berdyaev's bold assertion that creativity and sanctity should be considered separate but equal religious ways reflects a Russian 20th century impulse, a Promethean theurgic energy that characterized the early decades of the century. It is in this context that the scientific dimensions of Russian Cosmism can best be understood. Thus concludes 11.8, The Religious Cosmists. We will continue next time with 11.9, From the Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and his followers. I will see you then. Olam.